Built in 1862 and lived in by the priest of Borley, Reverend Henry Dawson Ellis Bull, and his family, Borley Rectory was reputed to be one of the most haunted houses in England. Unfortunately, the rectory burned down in 1939 and was finally demolished in 1944, but not before a number of reported hauntings had appeared in magazines and books of the time. The first ghostly occurrences happened right after the rectory was built, back in 1862, when locals reported hearing unexplained footsteps within the house and other strange sounds. In 1900, 4 girls that lived in the rectory, daughters of the priest, saw a ghostly nun at twilight. When approached, she vanished without a trace. These sightings happened regularly, with people claiming to see all sorts of spirits in and around the rectory over the next 40 years. In the late 1920s, a grim discovery was made by the wife of the then Reverend in the form of a human skull found wrapped in a paper bag and hidden inside a cupboard. As well as daily incidents of disconnected servant bells ringing by themselves, footsteps around the rectory, and unexplained lights in the windows, they also claim to have seen a phantom horse in a carriage at night. When the newspapers got a hold of the story, Borley Rectory's fame gained the attention of paranormal researcher Harry Price, who witnessed plenty of unexplained goings-on, including stones being thrown, and after allegedly faking some spirit messages being written on a mirror, he then declared the rectory free of ghosts. As soon as he left, however, they began again. After a long period of being unoccupied, the rectory saw habitation again in 1930 when the Foyster family moved in. Immediately they began to experience paranormal activity, bells ringing, stones being thrown, writings on the wall, windows being smashed and doors being locked, all without explanation. The Reverend's wife, Marianne, experienced direct poltergeist activity when she was thrown from her bed. Her daughter was attacked by what was described as something horrible, and despite the Reverend trying to exorcise the spirits from the house himself, the incidents continued. And self-proclaimed psychics who read the newspaper stories visited, but couldn't do anything about the phenomena. They did, however, think that most of the events were being caused by negativity, particularly from Marianne, whether she was doing it consciously or not. Later on, Marianne did confess that she did exaggerate some of the incidents to cover up an affair that she was having. However, this doesn't explain all of the paranormal activity witnessed over the many years, and although some of the investigations were carried out after the Foysters had moved out, not all the incidents can be explained so easily, and some not at all. In May 1937, Harry Price rented the property for 1 year and advertised in the Times for volunteers to join his investigations. 48 people applied. Whilst there, he experienced a number of paranormal events, and during an experiment with a planchette, one investigator received a message which seemed to confirm the legend, with a warning that the rectory would burn down. And almost a year to the day, the rectory is mysteriously destroyed by fire. Some believe, however, that the new owner, Captain W.H. Gregson, who purchased the rectory for just £500 and had insured it for £10,000, started the fire himself. In the years that followed, reports continued to emerge, the most recent occurring in the parish church. Harry Price died in 1948, and since then many skeptics have dissected his work, explaining all sound phenomena and other phenomena as misrepresented natural occurrences. Believe what you will, but all reports stretching over 100 years have cemented its place as one of the most haunted houses in England, and maybe even the world.
afternoon. Welcome to the inaugural live stream podcast event hosted by Curia Live. I'm very proud and pleased to be introducing this and later on talking in it. It is a subject that I think is dear to myself as a ghost hunter and to generations of ghost hunters here in the UK and around the world. Borley Rectory, the subject of today's talk, described as the most haunted house in England, perhaps the most famous haunted house in the world, certainly one of the most controversial, certainly one of the most written about, talked about and discussed. We have 4 speakers for you today. We have obviously myself later on, and we'll be talking about the rectory itself, the history of the case, how the ghost hunt started. Then we'll also be looking and examining the ghost hunters, the person who's most closely involved with Borley Rectory. That's the ghost hunter Harry Price, and we'll introduce Harry and we'll talk a little bit more about him later on. And we'll end with a reconsideration, perhaps a retouching of some of Borley and also some other notable and famous historic haunted locations here in the UK. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the first speaker today, Alan Murdie. Alan has been a colleague and friend of mine for a number of years. Alan is the chairman of the Ghost Club founded in 1862 or thereabouts, and is the oldest ghost investigation organisation in the world, and it's still in existence today. Alan is also a member of the Spontaneous Cases Committee for the Venerable Society for Psychical Research, which slightly younger at 1882, and again, still going in London. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Alan Murdie.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much, Steve, and thank you for our select audience who've come along to listen today to this session devoted to Borley Rectory. Borley Rectory, as Steve has indicated, is, in all respects, the most famous haunted house story in the world. It has occupied generations of researchers, and it was entered even when the Guinness Book of Records, now Guinness World Records, listed such things as the most haunted spot in the world. The site of unrivaled paranormal activity from its construction in 1863 to its rather spectacular horror film destruction in February 1939 by fire. One could say it is the ghost case which puts all others to shame. 5 successive rectors and their families over 76 years reported unparalleled numbers of paranormal ghostly phenomena. It's a case which has generated an enormous primary and secondary literature, and perhaps apart from the eternal mystery of the identity of Jack the Ripper, it is probably the biggest, longest running mystery to be solved dating from the 19th century, something which scholars are still arguing about today. Over the years, numerous people have claimed ghostly experiences of one form or another. Many of them were connected with the Ghost Club, others are local residents, and many more are drawn from the long stream of curious, interested visitors which the site has attracted and continues to bring today. Borley Rectory, rather ugly-looking red brick Victorian house, was built on the borders of Sussex and Essex, just over the Essex border, in 1863 by the Reverend Henry Bull. The Bulls were a big landowning family who monopolised not only control of the local lands, but were also powerful in the church. They were known as squiresons, incumbents who occupied both the role of squire, lord of the manor, and head of the church. The church was just across the road, Borley Church. The dedication to Borley Church is unknown. Which saint was given its dedication, if it ever has one, is a mystery. It has always been known from all historical records simply as Borley Church. Well, the rectory itself is no longer there and nothing remains upon the site, but it was an enormous building. It had to be. The Reverend Henry Bull, in his lifetime, managed to father a family of 14 children. And there are even rumours that he may have fathered one or two others with a lady other than his wife, including on a servant girl who died in mysterious circumstances in 1880. That aside, he was a powerful man, well respected as he had to be as a landowner and priest of the district, who nonetheless became convinced, as the story goes, that Borley Rectory and its grounds were haunted. And it's from his period of incumbency that the first ghosts are reported. Principally, the ghosts at Borley Rectory and the associated ground can be listed as follows. There is a ghostly nun who appears very lifelike. In fact, a number of witnesses described her rather sad or miserable expression. There was an account of a headless man, and one that, of course, all ghost hunters would love to see, a phantom coach and horses driven by a headless coachman. That was supposed to be across the lawn and the road outside. Then there was actually a member of the Bull family in later years, the Reverend Henry Bull's son, Harry Bull, who, after his death in 1927, was alleged to come back to the rectory, seen wearing his favourite plum-coloured red dressing gown. And then we move into the animal world. There were ghostly cats reported at Borley. And along with the apparitions, there were numerous accounts over the years of strange noises, of phantom footsteps, of voices, and most dramatic of all, at various periods, outbreaks of poltergeist activity. Now, you don't see poltergeists. You experience them typically as loud raps, noises, and the physical displacement of objects. Whereas you can say ultimately that maybe ghost sightings are down to subjective hallucinations, that explanation is much more difficult in the case of poltergeist activity, because we are talking about physical disruption, physical activity, things which are occurring in the world around us. The disturbance of objects, furniture, things like outbreaks of fire. These things cannot be ascribed simply to hallucination, because they leave physical traces which are measurable. They are occurring in the world around us. There is no shortage of evidence for poltergeist activity. Borley had more than its fair share of poltergeist activity over the years alleged as occurring to it. The popular model of the 20th century onwards is that poltergeists are inevitably something associated with adolescents and teenagers. That was originally the idea. The idea of the late 19th century, they were the products of naughty little girls playing tricks. That idea is still with us, but what makes poltergeists credible is that the fact the tricks are the same the world over. If we take a legal approach to the evidence for poltergeist activity, we find that poltergeists are proven in the same way that we would prove, say for example, crimes of serial killers or repeat sexual offenders. There is a similarity in patterns. Now this pattern shows up to an extent in the history of Borley Rectory, but it seems to be not a case of a person-centred poltergeist, probably about 75%, seem to be focused upon individuals, not just teenagers or adolescents, but also quite often older women. But there's also a good 25% which seem to be place-centred. And there were reports of successive poltergeist activity, which it is hard to pin down to one particular individual. There were certainly periods where Borley produced poltergeist activity which was quite intense, but the history, as well as the ghosts and apparitions, poltergeist activity is spread also through the history of the rectory. As I said, the first occupiers were the builder of the rectory with the Bull family. The story spread very quickly amongst the Bull family and locally that they were troubled during their dinner times by the appearance of a ghostly nun at the window, and to avoid being stared at as they were eating and drinking, the Reverend Henry Bull had the window bricked up. And Henry Bull lived there as the Squire Parson until his death at the rectory in 1892. He was then succeeded by his son Harry. Now, Harry claimed numerous experiences of seeing the nun and other spectres in the grounds of the rectory. He would apparently sit in the summer house and could, as the saying went, hail a spirit as readily as a human being. Skeptics have said that he was, pointed to the fact he apparently suffered from narcolepsy. He had a tendency to fall off into sleep and trances, and one could interpret this in two ways. One could say, for example, that Harry Bull was simply dreaming. He was asleep and fancifully having hallucinations or dreams in which he saw these apparitions. Alternatively, one could say it is actually consistent with what we know about ghosts at many other locations, many ghost reports. There is a fascinating time of day pattern which emerges when one looks at hundreds of ghost reports. One sees a kind of time of day phenomena. It's this: basically, nobody seems to see a ghost at breakfast time. None of the stories ever begin, I was eating my cornflakes when I saw. But as you pass through the day, you find the frequency of sightings of apparitions increases, with a peak between midnight and about 4 a.m., which fits in very much with traditional folklore, the idea that ghost apparitions appear between midnight and cockcrow. A good third of ghost witnesses from cases collected from the 19th century, includes my own experience of seeing an apparition in 2011, occurred when the witness was in bed. Now, it seems to suggest there's some link with brain chemistry, with the sleeping brain or the waking up brain or going to sleep state in which the brain is in. But we're talking about a kind of hallucination that can be seen by more than one person and can be seen by animals and also successively on different occasions. What the precise tie-up is, we don't know, but it was equally possibly interpret Harry Bull's encounters with spectres, particularly a headless man he said he saw in the garden, as possibly the display of some psychic, paranormal, mediumistic ability. To an extent where one pays one's money and takes one's choice, but again, his experiences are consistent with many people's experience in many lands over many years. Harry Bull was not the only one who saw ghosts at the rectory during this period. The most notable sighting occurred on the 28th of July 1900, when the four of the Bull sisters were present in the garden in late afternoon and saw the apparition of a nun gliding through the garden. They described the figure as dark, shadowy. They could make out something of a face, and they believed that the nun was telling her beads as she glided through the garden. They went towards the figure vanished away. It was a collective sighting, a story that they stuck to for the rest of their lives. They were interviewed in 1955 in an early edition of the BBC investigative journal, journalist for the programme Panorama, which is still running, did actually do an interview with one of the Bull sisters about this. They lived nearby throughout their lives, and they confirmed that sighting. Sadly, I fear this unique film record is now lost, but they never wavered in the story of seeing the nun. It was averred locally that the ghostly nun was the victim of a tragic love pact in the Middle Ages, where the nun had eloped with a monk in a carriage, broken her vows. However, they had been captured. The story went that the nun was walled up alive and the monk was hanged, as was the driver of the coach, and that's why they came back as ghosts. That was the folklore. There is no direct evidence that there ever was a nunnery on that spot, save for some investigations that were done at the site in 1954, which showed that there was an earlier building on the site of some description in the pre-18th century. What that was, however, is unlikely to have been a full-blown nunnery. Our records actually from the Middle Ages are quite good of religious institutions. But it was a colourful story which provided at least an explanation for the local people as to why they should be troubled by a ghost. Well, Harry Bull continued living at the rectory until his death there as well, in a room called the Blue Room in 1927. The rectory was then empty for a period, and a new couple moved in. It was a clergyman, an Anglo-Indian clergyman named Guy Eric Smith, and his wife Mabel. And very soon after moving into this building, which at the time had no running water on the mains, water came from a well and had no electricity, they were somewhat uncomfortable. They did actually have servants. Clergy salaries did run to employing maids at the time, but it was a fairly uncomfortable location, difficult, big rambling house, originally for 14 children, difficult to heat in the wintertime, but far more worrying to the Smiths were the ghostly manifestations. And it is here, at this point in 1929, that Borley comes to national attention. They complained of apparitions, they complained of strange noises, they were convinced, at the time it would seem, that the house was haunted by something, and they took the step of contacting the Daily Mirror. This is quite interesting for those of you who know your history of ghosts in the 20th century. The Daily Mirror, this was the first national coverage of Borley, but it was also famous many years later as the newspaper in Britain which broke the story in 1977 of the famous Enfield poltergeist. So never let it be said that the Mirror or the Daily Mirror has never done anything useful. It has contributed marvellously to ghosts and the whole business of hauntings in Britain. Well, they contacted the Mirror, who sent down a reporter, Mr. V.C. Wall. Soon somebody telephoned on a Sunday lunchtime, the leading psychic investigator known to the press in the day. This was a man called Harry Price, who wasted no time in going down to Borley himself, and very soon believed he'd witnessed stone throwing, an appearance of an apparition, the movement of a bar of soap, and a séance was conducted with the Smith family, and they came to believe that possibly Harry Bull was trying to contact them. But Price came away convinced that there was something going on, and it began what turned out to be a 20-year involvement with Borley and its story. we discussed later this afternoon, Harry Price was somebody who put psychic research on the map in the 1930s. He was controversial at the time because he had a gift for publicity, in fact, a desire for publicity. He made psychic research, the scientific investigation of the paranormal, newsworthy. He became world famous for some of his investigations. There was a wide range of them. He covered everything from firewalking, claims of levitation. He exposed phony mediums. He was involved with a very strange case of Jeff the Talking Mongoose on the Isle of Man in 1936, which the jury is still out as to what was going on there precisely. It may be perhaps best described as a very bizarre poltergeist case. He became notorious as well for a publicity stunt on Walpurgis Night, April the 30th, 1932, when he went to Germany and in a flair for publicity, he conducted a magical experiment to try and test the tradition that if you took a goat up the Brocken Mountain on Walpurgis Night, it would turn into a young boy. And they duly took the goat up the mountain, and they were followed by some 800 reporters from newspapers across Europe and North America. It ensured worldwide publicity. Didn't do much for his credibility, but it put his name on the map. And he was able to stand up at the end and say that now they've tested magic and that supernatural must be left behind. It must now be the matter of science. He insisted throughout he was a scientific researcher. Much can and will be said about Harry Price and his legacy and how people have interpreted him. But going back to his adventures at Borley, he wanted to continue his investigation with the new incumbents at the rectory. Now, this was the Reverend Lionel Foyster and his mysterious wife, Marianne. She was some 20 years younger than her husband, and Marianne Foyster is such an unusual character. She has become a subject of books and studies in her own right. She and her husband occupied the rectory for a period of 5 years, 1930 through to 1935, and it is during this period, for 18 months between 1930 and 1931, that some of the most controversial phenomena are claimed to have occurred at the rectory. Harry Price called on them with a lady called Kathleen Goldney, who was an active psychic researcher. Her day job was actually working with her husband as a midwife. They ran together the first artificial insemination clinic set up in London. And it seems that very soon Mrs. Goldney, on questioning Marianne Foyster, asked her about questions to do with her sex life, and rather presumptuously, boldly asked her if she'd ever had an abortion. Well, this did not go down well with the Reverend Foyster and his wife, and effectively it led to Price being banned from the rectory for the next 5 years. For the rest of the period of the Foyster incumbency, he was not welcome. But nonetheless, phenomena were again reported. This is again a controversial period in the history of the rectory. It's where the major poltergeist phenomena are reported as occurring. These included noises, raps, object movements. Mrs. Foyster claimed that she had been assaulted by the ghost and given a black eye. On another occasion, she had been menaced by a dark, shadowy form with claws. And most remarkable of all were a series of wall writings, messages scribbled on the wall addressed to Marianne in very rough scribbled handwriting, calls for light, mass and prayers. And Marianne Foyster maintained that there was something communicating with her. There was also the mysterious appearance of Roman Catholic medallions in the property as well. And the Reverend Foyster began a diary of being in a haunted house, living there. His health was deteriorating. The Foysters were unable to have any children of their own, and they seem to have had a series of adopted children living in the house who also complained of phenomena, as did certain visitors to the rectory. A friend of the Foysters, a man called Dom Richard Whitehouse, who later became a monk in 1931, maintained he had seen whole bottles materialise from the air and smash around Mrs. Foyster. There's also some evidence from local people, inquiries made in the 1990s from people who still remembered Mrs. Foyster, that the local doctor at the time witnessed poltergeist phenomena when visiting the Foysters at the rectory. There were all kinds of stories gathered from a lady called Claudine Matthias, who was the husband of a later clergyman. And opinions split as to whether Mrs. Foyster was simply an hysteric, faking the phenomena, or there was genuine phenomena going on around her. And this has been one of the big, long-running Borley disputes or debates as to the character of Mrs. Foyster. And she turns out to have been a very interesting character. Turns out she was married at least 4 times, at least twice bigamously during her life. And she's become a subject of speculation in her own right. She is a fascinating character, and a number of observers, journalists who went there during the period, seem to have concluded that something was not quite right with Mrs. Foyster, and she seems to have had a troubled life throughout her entire life, but particularly in this period. And it's simply for the period of poltergeist activity, which I said, which occurs over 18 months, that she became famous, and for the rest of her life, she never actually shook off this reputation. At the same time, although she has been much maligned, it seems that she seems to have suffered from a great deal of what's probably best described as Catholic guilt. She seemed to be despite being married to an Anglican clergyman, she seems to have been quite heavily into Roman Catholicism. And at least one of her bigamous marriages was conducted in a Roman Catholic church later on. She's a fascinating subject in her own right. Her life has been used to discredit all the reports of phenomena at this time, and it's even been suggested that the ghosts and poltergeist reports were contrived with her husband, who was hoping to write a best-selling book on the haunting before Harry Price. And it also explains, depending on one's conspiracy theories, why they would not cooperate with Harry Price. Well, after a visit from the Marks Tay spiritualist circle, all phenomena at the rectory ceased in 1931 in terms of major movement of objects, the wall writings and so on. Odd things happened thereafter, but certainly after the spiritualists who came and seemed to quell the ghost, it seems to have calmed down. Well, the Foysters stayed until 1935. The deteriorating health of the Reverend Foyster meant he suffered from severe arthritis, and his last sermon, he collapsed in the pulpit of Borley Church, had led him to be very much an invalid for the rest of his life, and the Foysters moved to East Suffolk. Thereafter, Harry Price returned to the rectory and saw his opportunity. It was an opportunity to rent the property. The Church of England had found no clergyman now wanted to take it, partly because of its lack of facilities, but also because of his reputation of ghosts and hauntings. Harry Price then rented the rectory for a year, and through an advertisement in the Times, he recruited a number of lay observers. whose job was to take on in shifts the job of going to the rectory and waiting for ghosts. And here we can actually see, in many ways, the model of ghost hunting, which has become so familiar with groups, televised appearances, and so forth today. It was Harry Price who very much pioneered these kind of techniques. He maintained it was going to be a scientific explanation. He was going to have try and get observers trained up using a special book of instructions to record phenomena. A whole guide, Blue Book of Instructions, was published, which included such advice as, if you see the nun, if you can, attempt to speak to her. And it was all kinds of interesting things. The idea was also to record as much activity. Now, again, observers went to the site, and some of them did report phenomena, including a return of the wall writings, or at least marks and scratches with pencil appearing on the walls. Having come from East Anglia myself, having first taken an interest in Borley in the 70s when I was a kid, I first visited the site in 1976. The story of the investigation and the hauntings was still a talking point. It remained in local memory. My late grandfather was a physiotherapist at the West Suffolk Hospital, and amongst his patients he had a gentleman called Mr. Arben, who had been a caretaker at the rectory during the Price occupation of it. And he told conflicting stories. On one hand, he said Harry Price was just a fake, was one claim, and then he equally said, well, he was also a very strange man. Mr. Arben and others claimed of strange experiences. Everyone who seems to have lived in the village at the time was either for or against the haunting. Obviously, those who experienced things had their experiences and came forward, became part of this Borley story at this stage. Particularly interesting were a couple called the Coopers, who lived in the coach house, or almost a kind of property, is also known as the Rectory Cottage, very close to the rectory itself. They talked about seeing, witnessing and hearing apparitions, phantoms in the property over a number of years. It got a lot of attention. Price conducted his experiments, at the same time also circulating as late as 2008 were stories that some of the phenomena in this period had actually been manufactured by prankster medical students from Cambridge, cycling over from Cambridge at night and playing tricks on Price's observers. Whatever the case, there's a large amount of observations from Borley Rectory at this time. One of the interesting things about Borley is that the phenomena seem to be seasonal, the reported phenomena. They are concentrated in the summer, not during the winter time. During the winter months, the rectory seemed to be quiet, flat. It was in the summer that the ghosts appeared. Well, after Price left the scene in 1937, it was briefly, although he never really lived in the building, occupied by a fifth rector, the Reverend Alfred Henning. But because of the inconvenience of the site, Reverend Henning and his wife decided to move into the rectory at the adjacent parish of Liston. Thereafter, the church decided that they had had enough of Borley Rectory. It was time to get rid of it, so it was sold, and it was sold to a character called Captain Gregson. Captain Gregson took over the building in 1938 and lived there. During his period of occupation, he also claimed to have experienced a number of strange phenomena. He claimed that one of his pet dogs was so terrified it ran away and he never saw the poor animal again. There were footsteps, all kinds of strange things, but also they did suffer at various stages from curiosity seekers. Price records by this stage locally, bus trips were being run from neighbouring towns of curious people who wanted to come and view the rectory, and some of them would actually play pranks, and he actually condemns in some of his writings some of the teenagers. Well, it was during the Gregson occupation that the rectory burnt down. Now, some of the research in Borley was by way of seances. It was conducted by a man called Sidney Glanville and his daughter, who conducted seances and visited the property. They received 11 months before the fire a prediction by means of a planchette that the rectory was going to be burnt down by a ghost which called itself Sunnix Amures and its compatriots. Now, the best guess is that Sunnix Amures is some kind of Latin pun, and it's actually the word senex from Latin and amores, which is linked up with Latin for bulls, and it was actually a way of saying old man bull. Well, that's one possible interpretation. But strangely enough, 11 months later, after in February 1939, the rectory did burn down. A fire started in the library, a lamp, paraffin lantern was overturned, and the rectory burned down. Studies suggest that maybe the fire was actually started by Captain Gregson as an insurance job. And indeed, there was a court case which was eventually settled out of court with a claim of £750, whereas Gregson had claimed £5,000 on the insurance. Everything points to that probably being the case, that Captain Gregson burnt down his own rectory for the money, if we look at the evidence so far as it can be gathered. However, during the fire, as might be imagined, various people claimed they saw ghostly figures amid the flames. And merely because the rectory was then a ruin, it didn't stop reports of ghosts in the ruin. There were claims of a phantom cat, of strange lights, and phenomena occurring through until its final demolition. But there was an interesting twist in 1943. A clergyman based up in Carlisle, the Reverend Canon Pythian Adams, came up with a theory that the nun had been brought over from the continent, and that the various communications and phenomena all indicated that the nun was actually buried on the site of Borley Rectory. 1943, Harry Price arranged for the digging up of the cellar, and lo and behold, they did discover some human remains, a jawbone of what was considered with the forensic science at the time to be a young woman. Interestingly, it was considered medical and dental opinion that this lady in life had suffered from a severe abscess in the jaw, and which would have been very painful, and many of the accounts of the nun describe her as sad or unhappy looking. So it's an interesting feature. The bones, such as they were of the nun, were later laid to rest in Liston churchyard. Well, the rectory ruins were finally demolished in 1945. By this stage, Harry Price had published not just one, but two books. His first had been in 1940, called The Most Haunted House in England. It was the best-selling book of its type in the psychic world through 1941. Apparently it was one of the most borrowed library books during the London Blitz. Following up his success with The Most Haunted House in England, he published the second book, The End of Borley Rectory, which took on the story of the discovery of the bones of the nun, included many other reports of people who had come to the site and claimed they had seen one thing or another. Thereafter, after the remains of the rectory were flattened, the haunting was believed locally to have shifted to the church, and the Reverend A.C. Henning, the vicar of Borley, in 1948 actually wrote what is now a very rare book called Haunted Borley, in which he records a number of his experiences. Previous member, now sadly deceased, of the Ghost Club, a journalist called Philip Paul, who worked in East Anglia in the 1940s and 50s, made a number of trips to Borley. He held 7 vigils on the 28th of July from 1948 through till 55. He waited for the ghost. In 1954, he dug up the rectory site with the help of an excavator and found traces of an earlier building, possibly medieval, underneath the rectory. The phenomena, however, largely seem to reduce from about 1960, but successive visitors to the rectory have claimed sightings of the nun, object movements, all kinds of phenomena being reported as well in the church. In the church itself, the Reverend Henning heard on several occasions organ music he couldn't explain, and a gentleman called James Turner, who lived on the site of Borley Rectory, growing mushrooms for a number of years, described a number of phenomena, including the smell of incense, the sighting of the ghostly cat, and strange incidents of a minor poltergeist nature. During this period, as part of the Borley controversy, the 3 members of the Society for Psychical Research, including Mrs. Goldney, who visited the rectory and caused such offence in 1929, brought out a book called The Haunting of Borley Rectory, which was very much a sceptical hatchet job and a posthumous attack on Harry Price and his methods. This was published with a man called Dr. Eric Dingwall, and a major driving force in it was another man called Trevor Hall. And between them, they launched a quite serious character assassination of Price as a psychical researcher. And this has coloured perceptions of the story ever since. It's not the end of the story, however, by a long chalk. Many people have since questioned their work. The point, indeed, could be made that even if one removes the involvement of Harry Price from the Borley story, there remains an enormous amount of witness testimony, claims of something strange occurring over many years in the area itself. There have been subsequent books. The Society for Psychical Research published a rejoinder to The Haunting, written by a man called Robert Hastings in 1969, and the literature and controversies have continued ever since. And, well, that's really just to give you an introduction. There is more than enough that we could go on with here, and indeed, for the rest of this afternoon, you're going to be treated with some of the finer details of this haunting. But I hope this is encapsulated for you, a summary of the hauntings and alleged hauntings of Borley. It's a fascinating case, and no matter how long it is talked about, well, it's almost become a legend. It is one ghost story which indeed will never end. But thank you very much for listening to me this afternoon. If there are any questions, I'll take any questions, but there's certainly a lot more to hear. Can I say thank you very much for listening this afternoon.
Right, I actually have been to Borley. Myself and Steve were invited there. On the site of the old rectory, there is now a set of modern houses, and we were invited to spend a day and a night there and do some investigation, see if we could spot the nun or any of the other phenomena that have been reported. Sadly, we didn't discover much. However, the homeowner had been doing a bit of digging in the garden. I think they were going to build a wall or an extension, and as part of that, they actually uncovered some of the ruins of Borley, some of the old foundations. So there's a real brick from the real Borley Rectory. So I'll pass it round after the talk so you can see if anything comes forward when you touch it. In the meantime, I'll put it on the floor because it's very heavy and it might break the laptop. So, Harry Price. Oh, I'm just trying to get the angle so I can read my notes and talk at the same time. So, Harry was very much a controversial figure. He also could be a bit of an unpleasant character. He very much liked the publicity, as Alan said. And this caused people to think maybe he's making some of this up. But there were some people who seemed to have taken it personally and set out on a bit of a vendetta. So I'm going to describe some of the things they've said about Harry, and then Steve will come on after me and try and defend them. So the main book that was written at the time, after the time, was by Kathleen Goldney, who was a parapsychologist, by Trevor Hall and Eric Dingwall. Now, the one who wrote the most about Harry Price was Trevor Hall. Trevor Hall seems to have had a bit of a personal vendetta against Harry Price. It's probably the best way of describing it. In fact, he reminds me somewhat of some of today's paranormal investigators, in that when someone was going to publish a negative review of one of his books, he threatened to sue them. And certainly you can see nowadays, every time paranormal investigators are threatened and told they might not be telling the truth, their first recourse is always to say, I'm going to sue you. So maybe we can't take what Hall said as gospel truth. However, it's interesting that some of the things he does say might have a basis of truth in them. Nanda Fodor actually defended Price. He gave a very strongly worded review of Dingwall, Goldney and Hall's book, which was The Haunting of Borley Rectory, but even he says that Price was a very difficult man to like. He was selfish, intent on his own glory, and intensely jealous. However, unlikable personal traits don't necessarily lead to the conclusion that Price was a fraud. And Dingwall was described by Fodor as being biased against psychical research, and Goldney he described as possessing a steamroller personality. However, she did change her views about Price later on, and she did come round to preferring Price's story of what happened at Borley as opposed to Hall's criticism of it. So Price fared just as badly, unfortunately, at the hands of Richard Morris in his 2006 book, Harry Price, the Psychic Detective. So Morris describes Price as spending money donated for psychical research on numerous mistresses, and even that he stole his own coin collection from the local museum and sold it to fund an illegal abortion for Stella Cranshaw. Of course, none of this was published until after Price's death. Also, in a further stretch of the imagination, Morris suggests that because Price was a member of the same archaeological society as a man called Dawson, who reputedly came up with the Piltdown Man forgery, then Price was in on that one as well, and he made that up. Further evidence of his character, or lack of it, is provided in his assertions that Price was also involved with the Nazis. This is all due to a draft letter which Price had written, where he was asking permission from Hitler to attend the Nuremberg rally, a letter that was never sent, and obviously he never went either. And at the time, people in this country were quite sympathetic towards the Nazis. This is obviously before all the more unpleasant stuff happened. So, Trevor Hall. Let's go through some of the criticisms he had of Price and see what we make of them. So in his book, The Search for Harry Price, Hall obviously had a number of problems, not just with the investigation, but actually with Price as a person. He accuses him of having a preoccupation with ancient manor houses, and furthermore, he lied that his grandfather was born in a manor house, which subsequently proved to not be true. He also accuses Price of using spurious heraldic honours on some of his book plates. Although, to be fair, nowadays a lot of people can go to any shop and get their own heraldry, and you can get book plates made of them as well. So I don't really think this is a cause for saying that his entire career was a sham. However, it was something that he was doing. Price certainly embellished parts of his life story, including claiming that he was born in Shropshire when he was actually born in London. He also embellished other parts of the family history, including saying that his father owned a lucrative paper manufacturing business and left an inheritance to Price. Price's father was actually a commercial traveller. Although if Hall's description of Price's father marrying his mother when she was 15 and pregnant is true, and his father was 40 at the time, it's perhaps understandable that he embellished his origins slightly, as it's not something he would have particularly wanted made public, especially in those times. However, this really can't be used as proof that Price also embellished happenings at Borley. A number of events prior to his psychical research days are also in dispute. He claimed to have set up a receiver and transmitter and managed to capture a spark on a photographic plate, which he ascribed to space telegraphy, although there's no evidence to back this up apart from Price's own report. There is some doubt about his archaeological interests as well, with reports from Price himself variously claiming both that he was involved in excavations in London and that he wasn't involved in excavations in London. Price reported a number of archaeological finds, including a silver ingot, allegedly from the time of the Roman Emperor Honorius. This ingot was subsequently reported to be fake. Price also caused controversy over the alleged Joanna Southcott's box. Southcott was well known in the late 18th and early 19th centuries as a prophetess, and had left a sealed wooden box reputed to contain a number of prophecies. She left instruction that it should only be opened at a time of national crisis, and must only be opened in the presence of the 24 bishops of the Church of England. There's more now, but at the time there was only 24. Price claimed to be in possession of this box and had it opened in the presence of the Bishop of Grantham. Disappointingly, the box proved to contain merely some unimportant papers, a lottery ticket and a horse pistol. Price claims that the box was the real Joanna Southcott's box were denied by both historians and Southcott's followers. We don't know where the box currently is, but Southcott's followers say that it does still exist and it does hold important information when it's opened. Price wrote accounts of what he described as his first encounter with a poltergeist. There appear to be a number of discrepancies within the account, though. This encounter happened in a Shropshire village in an old manor house. And initially, events were reported such as animals becoming untethered and pans of milk being found overturned. These events then moved into the manor house itself. Child's footsteps were heard on the landing, fires were raked out during the night, and the sound of heavy stamping footsteps was loud enough to drive the family out of the house. Price initially describes how he and a friend spent a night in the house. At around midnight, both Price and his friend heard the sound of heavy footsteps coming down the stairs, then starting to go back up the stairs. Price took a photograph whilst the footsteps were going back up the stairs, at which point they heard the footsteps stumble and something clattered down the stairs. Nothing was actually on the photograph when it was developed, and the clattering sound turned out to be a watch case that Price had filled with flash powder for the camera. But he'd used too much powder, and on taking the photograph, the explosion caused the watch case to catapult the case up the stairs from where it clattered back down again. However, Price also wrote other accounts of this first apparent poltergeist experience, where the dates aren't clear. Price describes how he was alone at the time, not with a friend as he initially describes it, and he also described visiting the manor house on his journey back to school in Shropshire, even though he was actually in school in London and lived within walking distance of the school. Price also describes the apparent legend of the manor house that the house had been built by a rich recluse, who had become a recluse due to a love affair that went wrong. His niece, Mary Hulse, who coincidentally had exactly the same name as Price's grandfather's first child, looked after the recluse and managed the house for him. One night, he strangled her in her bed. The recluse then spent the night wandering the woods, and in the morning threw himself into the nearby river. However, Trevor Hall tracked down the location of the manor house and checked the parish registers, which go back to 1592, and there is no mention of anyone called Mary Hulse living in the parish at that time. Another apparent anomaly with this case is the photograph taken by Price, described as being taken at midnight, which showed nothing except an overexposed photo of a staircase. In Price's belongings was a photograph of a house called the Lees, and Price had written on this photograph, the Lees, Walcott, Salop. In The Ghost That Stumbled, in the Confessions of a Ghost Hunter by Harry Price in London 1936, and this refers to the Mary Hulse case. And if his accounts of only taking this one photo is true, that must be the photo he took when he heard the sound of the footsteps on the stairs. However, the photo in the book, The Ghost That Stumbled, appears to show a superimposed ghost. It isn't a photo of the stairs, and it appears to have been taken at daylight, not midnight. The photo also has a label printed on the back stating Bennett Museum, Catalogue Number 7. However, no trace can be found of which museum, if any, this might be. There are discrepancies in Price's accounts of his archaeological activities as well. Price gave a lecture about Roman pulbra, where he exhibited a collection of Roman coins, which he claimed to have discovered locally over a period of years, despite him having only lived in the county for 12 months. Unfortunately for Price, one of the reports of his lecture mentions a collection of 130 Roman and Anglo-Saxon coins found at Arundel and Pulborough during a period of 42 years by a ploughman named Micklethwaite, and now in the possession of Mr. Price, who showed them on Tuesday night. So Price is claiming that he dug up all the coins when actually they were donated to him. Price also gave the impression that he had been the main archaeologist excavating the remains of a Roman villa. Unfortunately, again for Price, the president of the Society of Antiquaries had a letter to the editor published in the same journal that Price's lecture was reported in, which described how Charles Pretorius was the only archaeologist involved in the excavation. Having now given up the pretence of being an expert in coins and archaeology, Price now turned his sights on conjuring. As part of his extensive library of rare and unusual books, Price owned a copy of the so-called Burmese manuscript. This consisted of 60 inscribed palm leaves, and according to Price, was in Burmese characters, and had been executed by a scribe attached to the court of a local prince, who jotted down and explained the various effects of the native itinerant conjurers who called at the palace. Price apparently allowed Will Goldston, who was editing and publishing a book of magical secrets, to include in his book the best conjuring trick from this Burmese manuscript, the mysterious barrel trick. In later years, however, John Stewart, the professor of Burmese in the School of Oriental and African Studies in the University of London, and Dr. Pei, a reader in Burmese at the School of African and Oriental Studies at the university, both prepared reports on the conjuring. The manuscript does contain stories from the Jataka, or story of the Buddha's former birth, part of which does contain a description of something very similar to the well-known rope trick. However, this isn't included in Price's manuscript, despite him mentioning it as being part of it. So the manuscript, which he describes as being full of conjuring tricks, actually contains nothing of the sort. Moving on to Price's more paranormal anomalies, firstly is the story of the psychic child. Price tells the tale of how he was awakened from sleep by the soft patter of feet, as if a small child was running around his bed. He listened to the footsteps for about 10 minutes, and when they came back close to the bed, he switched his torch on. The sound stopped immediately, and there was nothing there to see. He searched his room to no avail, and mentions that his dog was still asleep in his basket in the kitchen. At the same time, a book was published called The Soul of a Dog, which was an illustrated book by True Stories. The foreword was written by Price. The book was actually about how animals have souls and how animals aren't just basically inanimate, that when they die there's nothing there. They have souls, we can see them after death. Now, Price wrote the foreword to this, and most of it was an almost word-for-word retelling of the psychic child story, only the child had been replaced by a dog that Price identified as being his old companion who was buried under his study window, as opposed to being in his basket in the kitchen, as he was in the first version of the story. So, sorry, can't read it in this light. Katie Boren, she describes how the Reverend Smith, a former rector of Borley, described to Sidney Glanville how a cook in the service of Mr. Bull died in his arms in the kitchen in the rectory. She'd given birth to a child, but the infant was never seen, and the whole matter was hushed up. 17 days after Smith had told this to Glanville, the first table tipping at Borley took place. The results from this experiment suggested that Bull was present in spirit, and he confirmed the story of the servant girl. The following day, Glanville found an entry in the Borley Parish Register describing Kate Boreham, which Katie apparently confirmed that she was a maid there. So Katie had been killed there. Katie had come back and had said that she was present in the rectory. A week later, a planchette experiment took place at Glanville's home, and the results from this suggested that not only Katie died there, but that Bull had murdered her. Price states in the end of Borley Rectory that at this séance, they learned Katie's surname and her date of birth, and immediately following this, the parish records were checked and Katie's details were found. However, Price said that the details of the séance were backed up with information from the parish registers, and in fact, the information in the parish registers was discovered a week before this séance took place. In reality, Kate was neither a maid or a cook, and she died in her own home in Sudbury, not in Borley, and she didn't die in childbirth either. So the whole story was not true, and the information that was apparently found that backed it up was found before the séance. In Poltergeist Over England, Price's description of a number of things might be viewed as being somewhat misleading. He states that for some years I've been acquiring books, tracts and records of these mischievous entities, poltergeists, with a view to preparing a comprehensive work on the subject. He further states in the appendix, most of the works have been acquired specially for use in the preparation of this monograph. All have been studied and many are cited in the text. This wording appears to suggest that Price had carried out much original historical and literary research and spent some considerable time collecting and collating these accounts. However, much of the work in Price's book had already been published by many writers previously, including Barrett, Carrington, Flammarion, Podmore and many others. So whilst Price could be commended for gathering together already reported poltergeist cases, a job arguably completed in a more thorough manner a number of years later by Carrington and Fodor, the impression that Price himself had spent some considerable time collecting these accounts was false. He simply drew from already published and easily available sources. A number of these sources can be identified as part of the old and rare books that Price obtained from the Reform Club as part of his extensive library, but which actually consists of journals and proceedings of the SPR and the American SPR, a couple of articles from the Encyclopaedia Britannica, and 4 of Price's own works. Incidentally, Price regularly overstated the size of his library by counting journal articles as books, so his claims of only 20,000 books is a considerable overestimate, as a large number of these were actually single journal articles. In this volume, Price also reuses his story of the footsteps that appeared by his bed. He'd already used the story with the explanation of the psychic child in Confessions of a Ghost Hunter. In the foreword to The Soul of a Dog, it was later ascribed to the spirit of his deceased dog. And in Poltergeist over England, he describes it as my only real personal experience of a poltergeist in my own home. So the character is morphed from a child to a dog to a poltergeist. In this version of the story, instead of the child or dog, the cause of the footsteps are alleged to be a destructive, noisy, cruel, erratic, thievish poltergeist. Price also pulled in other cases into his poltergeist book, including one of his other famous cases, Balakin House, and surprisingly Stella C as well, who Price describes in the book as a poltergeist medium, simply because she produced physical phenomena at her seances. Price further describes Willie and Rudy Schneider as poltergeist mediums, and as they have the ability to ring bells in sealed boxes. Price also included a number of fraudulent mediums in the book, as he seems to have decided partway through the book to abandon his initial definition of a poltergeist to include anyone who had managed to produce physical phenomena, whether fraudulent or not. He even included a description and illustration of Mrs. Samuel Guppy, who allegedly vanished from her home and reappeared instantaneously in a house 3 miles away. This was not only not a poltergeist, but was also a fraud, and Price had said himself that this case was a fraud. Price had suggested a connection between poltergeist and puberty, an idea he'd discovered had been proposed by earlier writers, and in Poltergeist over England, he appears to try and explain Stella C's psychic abilities by describing how her abilities started when she first menstruated, even though he didn't even meet her until she was 23, although Price describes her as being 21. We're not quite sure whether he was underestimating the age to back up his theory or whether she was underestimating the age to appear a little bit younger. As an aside, Stella stopped the sittings with Price when she became engaged, saying to him in a letter, "I'm now engaged to be married, and had the sittings been entirely business, it would have been different. But under the circumstances, it is not fair to either of you if I see you again." Price manages to turn this, by the first edition of Stella C, into the number 13 proved unlucky as far as we were concerned, for after this séance, Stella informed me by letter that she had decided not to continue the sittings. Her employment fully occupied her time, and she said the sittings made her feel tired, which is more than probable. So again, twisting all the information. Price also appears to have invented a case in his 50 years of psychical research, where he recounts witnessing the materialisation of a little girl who had died. He provided no evidence to back this up, either evidence that the girl existed, where it happened, or who was present at the time. Douglas Cragg reviewed the book and thought this story was a complete invention. He sent a copy of his review to Price. Price ordered Cragg not to publish the review. Cragg published it anyway, but then 5 months after the publication of this review, Price wrote to Cragg and conceded that he shouldn't have published the story. He later stated, in Search for Truth, that he'd not been entirely satisfied with the case and had published it very much against his inclination. Salter, a former president of the SPR, notes from his reading of Price's Borley books that Price gets away with his stories by ingeniously suggesting connections between occurrences belonging to different time periods, happening under different conditions and due to different causes, so hallucinations, faulty memory, fraud. There was considerable doubt about the story of the coffins in the crypt at Borley. The coffins were alleged to have moved with no human intervention. Ethel Bull told Price that the coffins moved, even though she didn't know where the entrance to the crypt was. Yet Bull told Underwood that she knew nothing about coffins moving. Evidence was suggested much later that in fact Bull did know about the crypt and had also been down there herself. So it's getting even harder to find out what's truth and what isn't, because other people involved in the case are now changing their stories. The Borley Rectory apports. So Price describes the throwing of small pebbles, a shower of keys, the appearance of a small gilt medallion and another medallion. Price suggests that the phenomena at Borley are connected with Roman Catholicism. He mentions on a number of occasions that the nun in the case that Alan spoke about was French, the medallions were French, and so there was a strong French connection. However, in all the other accounts from the people who were present there was only one single medallion, not two. At least some of the people present thought that the events of that night were faked, and the suspicion fell on Price, who after all was an amateur conjurer. In fact, Price gave a lecture on Borley in 1932, and beforehand, Lord Charles Hope wrote to Price saying he didn't want his name to be mentioned, and if it was, it should be made clear that he'd not been impressed with his experience of Borley and thought all the phenomena had a normal explanation. The description of the single medallion that was reported that night didn't match the description of either of the two medallions that Price later described as having reported. Interestingly, the original single medallion would support the idea of a religious house being present on the site at Borley before the rectory. The two later medallions described by Price were only described after Price had found out that there was never a religious house on the site, and coincidentally supported his later explanation of the nun having come from France. Lucy Kay, his secretary, was also there on that night, and she recalled there only being one medal, and Price said that she could have this medal. She returned it to him later when she heard he was writing a third book on Borley. In Sir Borley's book on Price, he described the original medal as being dug up during the Borley excavation of 1943. But Lucy Kay wrote in 1951, "I noticed the remark regarding the St. Ignatius brass being dug up. Silly man, I told him quite plainly that it was found with the keys in the early days." So again, we have the people who were present all disagreeing with each other. But I do find it interesting that the original coin backed up Price's original story, and when he discovered that couldn't have been true, suddenly it was two different coins that backed up his new story. So, a 1948 description from Charles Sutton of the Daily Mail. He visited Borley, accompanied by Price and Lucy. "After much noisy phenomena, I seized Harry and found his pockets full of bricks and pebbles. This was one phenomenon I couldn't explain, so I rushed to the nearest village to phone the Daily Mail with my story, but after a conference with my lawyer, the story was killed. The news editor said, 'Bad luck, old man. but there's two of them and only one of you, so they won't believe you, saying that it was fake. Mrs. Meeker claimed to have no recollection of the incident, although she remembered the visit. However, another report claims a letter from her saying Sutton didn't approach a telephone at all when they got back to the inn after being to Borley. Lord Charles Hope's notes at the SPR mention a large half brick crashing downstairs as Kay, Price and Sutton were standing at the top of the stairs. Miss Kay said Price gave a shudder when it happened, but Sutton accused Price of having thrown it. Kay suggested that Price attracted poltergeist disturbances, as nothing similar had happened at Borley when Price wasn't there. Hope states that a couple of weeks later, Kay told him that Price had had a heart attack due to the accusations made by Sutton. Sutton maintained that he had seen Price throw a large stone, and on making him turn out his pockets had seen several similar stones. The original statement by Sutton accuses Price of having bricks and pebbles in his pockets, so he must have had exceptionally large pockets. But Price always denied throwing the stones, and no mention of the stones in Price's pockets were made by Price, Hope or Meeker, only by Sutton, the journalist. The Dingwall, Goldney and Hall book. I do have problems with this book because the tone is highly critical from the start of it. They suggest that Price took advantage of the situation by using people who weren't paranormal investigators and prompting them with suggestion by giving them a copy of the Blue Book, which detailed all the alleged occurrences in the house. However, it is of note that they criticise Price for not looking at the possibility of normal explanations, but they also criticise him when he does suggest normal explanations. It's quite obvious, though, that they're subject to the same biases as they accuse Price of. They state that Canon Lawson and his family experienced nothing paranormal in the rectory, and they criticise Price for suggesting the phenomena might not occur consistently for everyone. But they then make the statement that Canon Lawson struck them as extremely reliable and level-headed, and not at all suggestible. So anyone who didn't experience any unusual phenomena are level-headed and not suggestible, and anyone who did experience anything was an unreliable witness. So obviously these are the first of the line of sceptical parapsychologists who are twisting the information to their own ends. Even when Price accepts that the original legend of the nunnery on the site of the rectory is untrue, the authors are very scathing about this. The authors indicate that he wants it to be true, that there was a nunnery there and was only reluctantly persuaded out of this view. But this isn't backed up by their quotes. And the language used throughout their book suggests that they're attempting a hatchet job rather than an unbiased discussion of the facts. Subjective reports are described as being accepted with enthusiasm by Price. And then another strange statement in this criticism is it is probably of greater interest and significance the fact that the local story of ghosts seen at Borley Rectory began during the Bull incumbencies. But as the rectory was built by the Bulls, I would expect that the ghostly phenomena started when the Bulls were incumbent there, because they built it. Lost my place because I can't see where I am. Price is criticised for not having any first-hand reports, rather a description by Price of what Miss Bull could remember of what her father and brother had told her, without dates or corroboration, and obviously in some instances after considerable periods of time. However, they're quite happy to state without other corroboration that Miss Bull told them Price had never given her the opportunity of approving the section dealing with her testimony, and that there were some mistakes. Price is also accused of exaggerating the report of the nun, claiming it had an expression of intense grief. But Miss Bull denied saying this. She said she'd never seen the face of the nun. The face had always been turned away from her. And Price states that when Harry Bull was in the garden with his dog, Bull saw the bottom half of a figure, which belonged to a headless man. Price's original notes, however, have no mention of the figure being headless, and Bull himself said that he thought it was actually a poacher. Now, Price's tendency to exaggerate is also demonstrated in Mrs. Byford's report of hearing someone walk down the passage, making a sound as if they were wearing slippers, and Price embellishes this to persistent footsteps and ghostly footsteps, although Byford hadn't used those terms, and in fact hadn't even opened the door to see if anyone was there. A number of events that could be explained were left out of the Borley books, although I suppose if the subject of the books was the paranormal phenomena, it would seem likely that Price would leave these out. Price apparently refused to believe that the dining room window was blocked up to stop being able to see the family eating dinner, and preferred to believe that it was to stop the ghostly nun from peering in the window. Right, so I've got a couple of minutes left. So I'm going to wrap it up because there's a lot more that we can say where people have accused Price of exaggerating, making stories up, but it's almost impossible to decide what's the truth and what's not the truth, because unfortunately the people accusing Price can also be shown of exaggerating and changing the truth. Personally, I believe there was something happening at Borley. There was something interesting going on, but unfortunately I don't think we're ever going to be able to unpick exactly what was going on due to the character and nature of the people who were investigating and the people who were investigating the investigator. So, make up your own minds. I would say, believe something happened, but take it with a very large pinch of salt. Thank you very much.
Borley Rectory, the most haunted house in England. Some might say the most contentious haunted house in England. We've heard from Alan Murdie, who outlined the details of the case. The rectory being built in the 1860s by the Reverend Henry Bull and subsequently lived in by his family, which included 14 children, which required that the rectory be increased in size by the addition of various wings and extensions down the years. I consider myself quite fortunate. I've visited the site a number of times. Like we heard from Anne and Winsper a little while ago, I also proudly have another brick from Borley, legally obtained at exactly the same time, courtesy of the owner of the property that now stands on the site. And as Anne said, he allowed us to, well, he himself chiselled and bolstered the bricks out of the foundations of the rectory. And using plans of the rectory overlaid onto the modern landscape, we were able to ascertain quite quickly and readily that the brick had come from the area of the drawing room. Now, the drawing room at Borley, as built by the Reverend Henry Bull, contained a notable feature, that of a bricked up window. The window in the dining room, drawing room, was bricked up, and as the story went, to prevent the nun, the ghostly nun, from peering in at the window as the family ate their meals or sat doing what families do, presumably watching the X Factor or whatever the 1870s equivalent of the X Factor might be. So that's another proud possession, and it sits alongside currently the world's only scale model of Borley Rectory in its entirety. Unfortunately, it is far too big a model to transport for this event. It would have been nice, but it was not to be the case. This is an O scale, so 1/43rd scale replica, handmade model of Borley Rectory, and it's detailed right down to the internal parts. So perhaps for a future podcast. But we've heard a little about Borley, and we've touched upon some of the things that took place that Price wrote about in his book. the two books he wrote. We've also heard from Anne that perhaps Price wasn't everything that he appeared to be. Now, I grew up as a child in the 60s as a fanboy of Harry Price. I read his books. I first came across him in the Guinness Book of World Records, which is quite a place to find a ghost hunter. It mentioned in a brief paragraph the most haunted house in England, and contained a very small, faded black and white photograph of Borley Rectory. And a paragraph underneath said that it had been investigated in the 1930s by Harry Price. I took myself up to the local library, found a copy of the book, and I was immediately hooked. Price was first the primary investigator, a gentleman we heard from Alan, we heard from Anne, to which we owe a great deal as modern 21st century investigators. Some of the techniques that he pioneered we use to this very day. He wrote the very first set of instructions. The book, you've heard it called the Blue Book. It was called the Blue Book simply because it was printed cheaply. It had a blue cardboard cover. And there were only 50 or 60 copies ever printed. There are perhaps even less than a handful in existence in the world to this day. They were cheaply printed. They were a set of guidance notes for those he recruited for the year-long investigation of Borley when he rented it from 1937 to 1938. But every time Harry Price's name is mentioned, every time Borley is mentioned, it comes with a caveat. The controversial Harry Price. Harry Price, he was flawed. He was a fake. He threw the bricks at Borley. In fact, in a modern, fairly recent television portrayal in the UK, Price was described thus: as a failed psychic who turned to ghost hunting and creating fraudulent ghosts in order to take money from the gullible. Price has Google Harry Price's name. At the end of the podcast, go on to Google Harry Price's name. Look at what they say about Price. That he was a charlatan, that he was a fake, that he made up everything at Borley, that nothing you can read about Price you can take reliably. But is that the real Harry Price? Is that the man who really did investigate Borley? Well, I'm going to take you back a little bit before we talk more about Price's reputation. Price had, from an early age, an interest in the paranormal. He came into it via an interest in magic and conjuring. He, as a schoolboy, had seen the magician, the great Sequoia. Now, this was a travelling show, a snake oil salesman, a magician, a street entertainer. And Price was immediately captivated by Sequoia and fascinated by magic and illusion. Later, that interest spread into an interest in the paranormal, because Price realised that many of the tricks that were being used by the mediums, the stage mediums, were exactly the same that he knew as a magician himself, and not just an amateur magician. Price was, in fact, very high-ranking in the Magic Circle, the British Magic Circle, which is the governing body to which all magicians aspire to belong. In 1925, Price developed his interest further. He founded the National Laboratory for Psychical Research, a direct competitor, a scientific organisation. The National Laboratory for Psychical Research, with its headquarters in London, with the sole aim and objective of objectively and scientifically studying all forms of paranormal phenomena and claims. These included the testing of mediums. He tested many famous mediums. He tested the famous Schneider brothers, Rudi and Willi Schneider, who were from Germany, from the same town as Adolf Hitler was born. When Price encountered what he considered to be genuine mediumship, Price was very forthright in coming forward and saying that in his opinion he was able to show under good degrees of control that the medium had done something significant and challenging. Price also devised many controls. He had electric gloves and electric slippers that the medium and all of the sitters in the seance would wear, arrayed to a bank of lights on the wall that would show if anybody moved a hand or foot. The mediums were under very tight control. He used advanced techniques that we consider in the 21st century to be the stuff of ghost adventures and the stuff of ghost hunters. Infrared film photography and infrared, he used three-dimensional photography. He used a number of devices which he himself invented and built. The telekinetoscope was one. This simple device in which the medium was invited to cause inviting the spirit to cause a light bulb to illuminate by pressing a button. But the button was protected by a glass cover. And underneath the glass cover, the button was protected by a soap bubble. So first of all, they would have to penetrate the glass dome, and then they would have to activate the button without bursting the soap bubble, which protected it. When somebody pointed out to Price that the cable could be interfered with, he used armour-plated cable in the telekinetoscope. When the Ryan Institute invented the famous Zener cards, these are the famous cards that everybody interested in parapsychology or even mediumship will be aware: the star, the wavy line, the triangle, the square, and the seahorse. These five famous symbols, Price obtained a pack of these Zener cards. They were invented by the psychologist Carl Zener for the Ryan Institute in order to test the latent ability of some people to precognitively know which symbols were going to come. Price realised that the deck had been made and it was see-through, that in the right lighting conditions you could see through the cards. So he went back and he redesigned his own set of telepathic cards, which used a dazzle background pattern and which he had made by a British games manufacturer on thicker card and with this dazzle back on them in order to improve upon the Zener cards, and indeed resulted directly in an improvement of the Zener cards. So it was no surprise that Price was called upon by the newspaper after they had been contacted by the Reverend Smith about this most haunted house, this rectory in which all of this stuff was taking place. Price was almost the first person that they would pick up the phone. He was the country's acknowledged leading expert on ghosts and the paranormal. He had a research laboratory that was well equipped. It had a photographic darkroom. It had an engineering facility. It had seance rooms. It had one of the most extensive libraries on the subject in the country. Incidentally, Price had spent his entire career from founding of the NLPR up to the commencement of Borley in the 1930s, the commencement in the 1920s, trying to convince academic universities in the United Kingdom and later in America and in Europe to take the subject seriously, that this needed to be the subject of serious academic research. He offered not only his entire library on a permanent loan basis to any academic organisation that would take this or set up this research establishment, he offered funds. And when they didn't come forward, he himself decided to take and set up his own organisation. So Price was the logical person to investigate. But Price didn't actually do very much investigating, because one of the problems with Price is he had a heart condition. He'd had a heart condition. He'd been diagnosed from quite an early age with angina. He had a weak heart. And it wasn't... He realised also that if his investigation was to have credibility, then he would have to call upon independent researchers. Also, he realised that he was a very busy man. He was much in demand from the media, and he couldn't devote his entire attention to spending an entire year within the walls of Borley Rectory. And so he recruited a team of investigators, one of whom, we've heard his name mentioned earlier, was Sidney Glanville. Now, Glanville was the lead investigator for Borley Rectory, and there is not one single skeptic, there is not one single criticism of Glanville by anybody. And in fact, Glanville's work at Borley remains as, on behalf of Price, on behalf of the National Laboratory for Psychical Research, remains as a landmark for psychical investigation. Harry Price himself, in his books, commences with, "No living man is as well qualified to write this account as S.H. Glanville. The contents of the locked book were compiled by my chief official observer, Mr. S.H. Glanville. If all other existing records of Borley were to be destroyed, and only the locked book saved, it would form a complete history of the haunting. It will forever be a model for psychical researchers as to how a report is to be prepared." Unfortunately, it is the locked book that's missing, that's gone, and we're left only with the other output, the other side of Harry Price, to judge the man. Price was, to our 21st century eyes, very modern, very forward-thinking, because he wanted to push his agenda. He wanted the academic mainstream to take on board the need and the necessity to study the paranormal, for psychical research to be recognised as a legitimate area for science to study. There had been scientists who had been interested in studying this area before: Sir Oliver Lodge, Michael Faraday. Many scientists had studied this, but no university had taken this as a legitimate course of study. They hadn't set up a department. There had been no chair in parapsychology or indeed any para subject. And Price was very keen to do this. And he realised that if you want to exert pressure on anyone, you need to get the public on side. And to get the public on side, you need to work the media. Modern investigators, you see them on television, they work the television, they work the social media, they work all of the media opportunities in order to promote themselves and to promote their products. Price was doing exactly the same thing. Today, we don't think of that as unusual in any way. Back in the 1920s and 1930s, particularly in Britain, it was considered to be a very ungentlemanly thing to do. So Price left us two legacies. Price left us The Most Haunted House in England, his first book, and he left us The End of Borley Rectory, the second book on Borley, a number of articles which he did for newspapers, and several interviews that he did. And he was in the process of writing a third book on Borley when he was found dead in his study at Arran Bank in Pulborough in 1948, at the tender age of 67. So the judgments made against Price are based upon his written output. They were based in part on the locked book, because it did exist at that time. In fact, it still might exist today. And the work of one man. Now, this man, Trevor Hall, there we are, this is the gentleman. Trevor Hall is described as a British author, a surveyor, a skeptic of paranormal phenomena, and that one who made controversial claims regarding early members of the Society for Psychical Research. His books caused a heated controversy within the parapsychology community. He was born in Wakefield, England, and served in the British Army during World War II. He had a deep interest in magic and a deep interest in mystery. He was a student of psychical research at Trinity College, Cambridge, between 54 and 56. He had an extensive knowledge of conjuring and magic, and he wrote a number of books, all of which were critical, in the large part, when they relate to psychical phenomena. His first book, The Spiritualists, or one of his early books on the Spiritualists, accused the psychical researcher and eminent chemist, William Crookes, of having an affair with the medium and just plain fraud. Not content with that, he then turned his pen towards Edmund Gurney, another founding member of the Society for Psychical Research, laying the claims of that Gurney, amongst the other things, after discovering certain frauds, had then committed suicide. A charge that was strongly contested by Gurney's biographer and other researchers subsequently. One of the most famous mediums in the world, Daniel Douglas Hume, the man who floated out of one window and floated back into another window, was next on Trevor Hall's list of criticisms and critiques. Hall asserted that the medium had invented his aristocratic background and concluded that the alleged levitation of Hume at Ashley House never happened, as all the eyewitness reports contradicted each other, and all Hume did was to step across a gap of 4 feet between the two windows. Now, Hall was the junior partner in the 3 people who were commissioned, effectively, by the Society for Psychical Research to re-examine the case of Borley Rectory. This was posthumously following the death of Harry Price. And in fact, in the introductory note to the book that they subsequently published, and it was also proceedings by the Society for Psychical Research, this report is the result of an inquiry conducted by Dr. E.J. Dingwall, Mrs. K.M. Goldney, and Mr. Trevor H. Hall at the invitation of the Council of the Society for Psychical Research. And so, armed with their research notes, the 3 set to work and produced a book that was damning from the first page to the very last about Price and the Borley investigation. Now, the book made many accusations. I'm not going to even bother to go through all of the accusations in the book. You can get a copy. But let's just compare what Price was actually doing. They were basing a lot of their accusations on a book, The Most Haunted House in England, and the second book, The End of Borley Rectory, which were written for public consumption. These were not intended to be investigation reports. I've written plenty of investigation reports where you detail the measurements, you detail who was present, what happened, what transpired, and I've written many public consumption versions of the same investigation notes. And they're very different beasts of very different character. What you're trying to convey in one is a sense of the overall investigation. You give edited highlights and snippets of information. Because if any of you have ever read an investigation report, it's probably about as dull as a set of tax returns in reality. And would never have been a seller. Price realised that he was going to get the public on side to promote his cause for promoting psychical research as a legitimate branch of scientific study. He was going to have to get people reading his books, working the BBC, promoting the investigations and the legitimacy of the science. So he would do things like, he did the world's first ever live ghost hunt, which he did in 1936 from Mepham, another haunted manor in Kent. He was not uncomfortable about playing the media. When we heard from Alan earlier today, we heard about how he took 800 reporters up a mountain at Brocken in Germany with a goat to turn it into a young boy, a young handsome Adonis. Now, Price knew from the off that this was doomed to fail. The goat wasn't going to turn into anything but what it was a goat. What Price was showing was science needs to look at this to test this claim, because the claim was if you do these certain incantations and certain spells in a certain order, then a goat will turn into a boy. Well, Price knew that was rubbish. But you can't just simply say, that's rubbish. I will take a goat, I will take it to the place where people say, I will do the incantations, I will do the spells, and oh look, it's a goat. But Hall, Goldney, Dingwall, and subsequent others have said that this was just ridicule, that Price had conducted this crazy publicity stunt. Yes, he did. He did it as a publicity stunt to demonstrate the fallacy and folly of, I've invented a new word, fallacy. The fallacy of not exploring the claims that are being made, not taking these things at their face value. Trevor Hall, let's come on to this gentleman again, this surveyor, this psychical researcher, this man of interested in magic, interested in conjuring. Trevor was a partner in the writing trio who were involved in the haunting of Borley Rectory, produced in 1955-56 at the behest of the Society for Psychical Research. Now, the people recognised that the book was flawed from the start, and in fact, in the 1960s, the Society for Psychical Research did redress that somewhat with the Hastings report, which was published in 1969, where Robert Hastings re-examined the evidence of the first inquiry and pointed out that it too was deeply flawed. Not notwithstanding, though, Hall seemed to have a major problem with Harry Price. They had never met. They had moved in different circles, and yet for some reason Hall has this serious problem. I don't know whether he slept at night or fell asleep at night without thinking about what he could do to Harry Price, because he wrote another book with Eric Dingwall called Four Modern Ghosts, which was published in 1958, and in which he devotes an entire chapter to Harry Price and an attack on the Rosalie case. This is the case where Price regretted publishing, or was said to regret publishing it, where he visited a house and where he believed he saw the apparition of a young girl. Now, as an investigator myself, with many years' experience, Price's acknowledgement of perhaps it was best not to publish is more based on the fact that what Price experienced that night may just be so astounding that it doesn't bear telling properly, because it was done without the controls that Price would have liked. I too have been in situations where astounding things have happened, and the next day, when the sun comes up, you can't rationalise it very well. And any attempt to explain what took place just makes it seem ever more ludicrous. And that's probably more why Price had decided it was a bad idea to publish. But nonetheless, in Four Modern Ghosts, Trevor Hall spends an entire chapter having a go at the Rosalie case. He still couldn't put Harry Price out of his mind. And in 1965, he wrote A New Light on Old Ghosts, which was basically Trevor Hall having yet another go at Price. On and on he went through his books. Hall also then started to bring in Paul Tabori. Paul Tabori was, after Price's death, given the job of being Price's official literary executor, and had written an earlier biography in 1950 of Harry Price. But Hall launches an attack against Tabori and Peter Underwood, another respected British investigator and chairman of the Ghost Club, saying that they were sycophantic towards Price and that they were just copying what Price had left. Finally, in 1978, Trevor Hall produced his definitive work. The work is his cathartic search for Harry Price, a book in which he finally laid bare all of his charges against Harry Price. The book was described by many as the most vitriolic, vile, ill-thought-out attack on one person that they've ever had the misfortune to read. Those that Hall had spoken to during the writing or the research for the book started to distance themselves from anything to do with Hall and the book itself and his charges against Price. He laid bare that Price's father may have had a relationship with his mother when his mother was considered to be, I suppose, a minor, that she was 14 or 15 years old at the time, and that this would have caused some scandal. Now, Harry Price, who was keen, as I said before, to promote the idea of psychical research as a serious academic pursuit, would be very well aware of the British class system that operated in the 1920s and 1930s. He would be very well aware that one of the things that would not help him at all was his standing as the son of a mere travelling salesman. So it wouldn't be too fantastical, particularly as the books were written for the popular consumption, for Price to maybe want to bury his past a little bit, to maybe want to bury that little bit of scandal. I think many families have got skeletons in their closet that have been a generation or two swept about and we don't talk about. So Price did possibly cover up his past, or cover up the past of his father and the scandal that existed. A scandal that we don't think of that significant today, but I know my grandparents' generation, they would have thought of this as, this was an era where girls were sent away for being pregnant. They were sent away to have the child secretly, and it was never spoken about again. So if indeed Price, if Hall had been, is correct, and Price's father did have a relationship with Price's mother when she was of a very young age, that resulted, or would have resulted in a potential scandal, Price would certainly never have revealed that, and would have actively pursued whatever lines he could do to keep that past buried. Now on to Trevor Hall himself. Alan Wessoncraft was the curator of the Harry Price Library, and was asked in 2000 as the curator of the Harry Price Library to write a foreword to a book on Borley Rectory. And he chose not to write very much about Borley Rectory, but to write quite a great deal about Trevor Hall. Now, I have a number of private letters from Alan Wessoncraft to other researchers that go into far stronger language than he uses when describing Hall in the foreword of Edward Babb's book on Borley Rectory. I have never met anyone who had a good word to say for Trevor Hall. I enclose a copy of the memorandum that proves conclusively that Hall obtained possession of the locked book by a disgraceful and outrageous act, i.e., he stole it. And in fact, I just want to just get to the right section, because what transpired is, under the pretext of Glanville loaning Hall the book, Hall then claimed that Glanville had bequeathed him the locked book. This is the definitive record of the investigation of Borley Rectory. What did Hall do with it? He sold it. He sold it to a book dealer, and it ended up in America. We don't know where it is. So if anybody's watching this podcast and you have Sidney H. Glanville's The Locked Book, The Investigation Reports of Borley Rectory, you would be doing psychical research one huge favour by re-releasing the information that's contained within it, because that is the actual account of Borley. Within that book, there are extracts of it that do survive. For example, in October of 1951, there was an edition of American Fate magazine published, in which Sidney Glanville himself who was Price's chief official observer at Borley during the tenancy of 37 and 38, gives a concise history of the hauntings and describes his visits to Borley and the visits of other investigators. Now, at no point does Hall or any of the subsequent skeptics of Price ever point a finger towards Glanville. They speak of him only in the very highest esteem, that he was a man of impeccable credentials, that this was a man who is beyond question. So let's look at some of the things that Glanville mentioned about the Borley Rectory case. Now, we've heard, and you will read on the internet, that it was all the fantastic work of Harry Price, that he created it, that he was caught by Charles Sutton, the newspaper reporter, with pockets full of, very big pockets full of bricks, and throwing them around the place and creating this stuff because he was an amateur conjurer, and with also accusations of ventriloquism at the time as well. However, Price is called in the 1920s, in 1929, by the Reverend Guy Eric Smith. The Reverend Smith writes to the newspaper as an act almost of desperation, saying that him and his wife are at their wits' end, all hell's been breaking loose at this rectory that they're living in, and can somebody come and help? What Smith was probably after his investigators from the SPR coming along. The newspaper immediately contacts the authoritative figure of Harry Price, and Price turns up. But Price didn't start it. These events had been happening since the building had been built. Price didn't give the rectory the name of, the reputation of, the most haunted house in England. He heard that from somebody in the village when he arrived to commence the investigation. He asked for a taxi to be taken up to Borley, and the taxi driver said, "Oh, you mean the rectory, the most haunted house in England?" The title was given to Price by a cabby. So we heard about the phantom nun being seen on the lawn of the rectory, which Price gives an account of in the books. Glanville gives an accurate account from his interviews with the Bull sisters. Miss Ethel Bull and her sisters Frida and Mabel, the daughters of the Reverend Henry Bull, were born in Borley Rectory. They have assured me that on a June afternoon, when they were returning from a garden party and had just entered the rectory garden, they all three simultaneously and quite clearly saw the figure of a nun walking slowly on the other side of the lawn. They were astonished as, although the apparition had been seen many times at dusk, they had never before seen it in daylight. Miss Ethel Bull ran into the house to bring a fourth sister to see the phenomena, and fortunately found her immediately. All four sisters watched the grey figure walk slowly across the lawn as she neared the trees which bounded the lawn. The nun gradually faded and disappeared from the sight. During the past 50 years, more than 20 people have reported seeing this apparition. One man, a guest of the Bulls, who knew nothing whatever of the story, came into the house to ask the rector about the nun he had seen walking in the garden. There are people who stoutly maintain that the apparition was seen only a few weeks before the rectory burned. There is a part of the garden known as the Nun's Walk. She usually appeared from an adjoining field, stepped over a low stone wall and walked across the lawn, eventually disappearing among the trees separating the garden from the lane. There is persistent evidence of this apparition being seen by both residents of the rectory and by strangers. That isn't the writing of Price. That is the writing of Glanville. And Glanville is writing that after speaking to Ethel Bull and the other sisters. This is not the public consumption account that Price wrote in The Most Haunted House in England and The End of Borley Rectory. These are from the investigation notes that Sidney Glanville compiled for Price, upon which Price drew to compile the books. During the incumbency of the Reverend Harry Bull, there was a good deal of paranormal activity, which he quite openly admitted. This is decades before Price. In nearly all parts of the house, footsteps were heard, particularly in the bedroom passages. They would reach a door, stop, and then 3 taps were heard, never more than 3. The figure of a tall man in dark clothes was seen on many occasions. One of Reverend Harry Ball's sisters was awakened several times by a slap on her face. Now and then loud crashes were heard in different parts of the house. At this time, manifestations were heard in the living rooms over the stables, which were entirely separated from the house. The groom gardener and his wife were disturbed night after night by knocks, thuds, and sounds of breaking crockery, although nothing was ever found to have been broken or even moved. They put up with these conditions for 3 years before leaving. There is a hardcore of evidence given by reliable and intelligent persons as a result of their own experiences and observation, which cannot be shaken by examination and questioning. For instance, Lady Whitehouse, who has known the rectory and its successive residents for many years, assured me, Sidney Glanville, that on one occasion, when she was helping to nurse Mrs. Foyster, she saw a medicine bottle leave the mantelpiece and float through the air, coming to rest on the floor beside the bed. She not only assured me of the complete truth of this incident, and many others, but voluntarily offered to swear an affidavit confirming this to be true, if so asked. Does that sound like Harry Price was creating these magic tricks? Does that sound like it was the work of Price? The Smiths who called upon the newspaper who brought Price in, report to Glanville when being interviewed. On several occasions, the heavy shutters to the French windows in the library, which slid into cavities in the walls, were pulled sharply together. They had been in the room when this had happened. These shutters were exceptionally heavy and required considerable force to bring them together. They were each about 6 feet high and about 3 feet wide. It was a common thing for them to hear brass rings, which are let into the wood frames and used for pulling them apart, rattling. I heard this myself while sitting in the library one night. Glanville records more than 2,000 incidents, the vast majority of which Price wasn't even in the same county, let alone the building when they were reported. Showers of keys, showers of bricks, of objects being moved and displaced, of apparitions of phantom footsteps and phantom voices. They had mysterious markings and writings appear on the wall, which Glanville records in the investigation notes. Price ordered that they be chemically examined to see if it was graphite from a pencil. Price wasn't a fool. Price was a good investigator, but Glanville was his chief investigator. And Price said, if everything else disappeared and we were left with only the locked book, we would have the true investigation. Unfortunately, thanks to Trevor Hall, that is precisely the one thing that's now gone missing. One more final thing about Hall. In his search for Harry Price, in his final book, in the book that he spent so much time on, his cathartic 1978 book, he devotes an entire chapter to Harry Price's book plates. Now, as I said before, and as Alan and Anna said before me, Price did use armorials that didn't belong to him, but belonged to the Price family. We can buy them today. You can buy armorials. You may have no connection with that family, but they look good over the mantle. Price did the same with his books. Hall makes a big thing about this is proof that Harry was prepared to commit fraud. He may have had a reason to hide his background. And Hall goes detail through the 4 series of the book plates, saying that Harry had purloined books that he covered, other libraries' book plates with his. So imagine my surprise when opening my own copy of The Search for Harry Price, which has been on my bookshelf for the last 4 or 5 years, and I have read it, to discover it too has a book plate hidden by a modern dust jacket that I didn't put on. But when moving The bookplate turned out to belong to Trevor H. Hall. It said Ex Libris Trevor H. Hall. It was Trevor's own copy of his own book, The Search for Harry Price. Now, of course, you can imagine my astonishment, my shock, the wonderment that I had this man, the man that devoted his life to attacking Harry Price, and I immediately noticed the bookplate. And if we can produce the bookplate, this was the man who accused Price of manufacturing his armorials. We can see Trevor H. Hall, JP, because he was a Justice of the Peace. He was a magistrate. He was a Fellow of the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. Alan Wessoncraft, the curator of the Harry Price Library, points out that he claimed to have a bogus MA, that Hall never had an MA, but he put it on his bookplate. But look beyond the MA, there is also a PhD. So, somewhat intrigued, I thought, well, there must be a record of his PhD. Dr. Trevor Hall, I mean, this was a man with an ego. He would have been Dr. Trevor Hall because he was working alongside Dr. Eric Dingle. It wouldn't have been, this is a man to whom position was important. There is no record. I was informed this morning that Leeds Library do have a copy of a doctoral thesis, but there is no record of it ever having been submitted. And it comprised basically an extended bibliography of magical books and tracts. So the man who wrote an entire chapter on bogus bookplates certainly knew a thing about bogus bookplates. This is the man who has damaged irreparably the reputation of the man who may have been the greatest ghost hunter to this day. A man to whom every ghost hunter has to pay a debt of thanks. Thank you.
Years and years and years ago, I worked for a TV show called Most Haunted that some of you may have seen. They hired me as a researcher, and I spent a couple of happy seasons off stage, occasionally on stage. Every time I appear as something different. Sometimes I'm an expert, sometimes I'm a historian, and sometimes I'm a parapsychologist. But I often used to stop and think, most haunted, what a meaningless term. How do we measure how haunted somewhere is? I'm sure that some of you in the audience tonight are living in houses that, by some measure, are haunted. But how do we tell if your home is more haunted than yours? How does one decide that somewhere is the most haunted house in England? Okay, 1985. I was a young schoolboy, 16 years old, doing my A-levels in Bury St Edmunds, Suffolk. And my brother-in-law said to me, "Have you read The Most Haunted House in England?" And I said, "No, what a load of tosh." And he said, "It's just down the road." And I said, "Yeah, Ross, isn't it? I don't believe in ghosts." Because I didn't, because I was a 16-year-old and I knew better. My parents believed in ghosts. I didn't. That all changed a couple of years later when I actually had a really uncanny experience that led me to become deeply fascinated by the whole idea of the supernatural. But for the moment, let's stay with me at 16, doing my A-level history project and browsing through Bury Archive, where we found a series of books relating to Borley Rectory, one of which I've just discussed with Steve Parsons, because it did look to us like it could have been a version of the infamous missing locked book. But it didn't matter. I found the works of Harry Price, and I flipped through them and I thought, what a load of tosh. Haunted rectory. But I had the presence of mind to talk to my grandmother about it. Now, old Alice Bentley, she grew up in Bury St Edmunds. Anyone here from Suffolk or ever been to Suffolk? Yeah, well, Borley's a strange place. I mean, the thing about Borley is, it's hard now because we all know it through the ghosts. But if you grew up near there, it's basically the arse end of nowhere. Yeah? You drive from Bury St Edmunds south down the A134 towards towns like Lavenham, but you actually get to Long Melford. Now, Long Melford has no reason to exist apart from antique shops. When I was growing up, They had 68 antique shops, but they didn't have a fish and chip shop. What is wrong with a town that has 68 antique shops and does not have a fish and chip shop? Anyway, Long Melford, just as you come into Long Melford, which has got a magnificent wall church. It's got a huge graveyard, but the church is like a cathedral. It dominates the whole village. There's Kentwell Hall at one end, which is an Elizabethan manor, which is again very beautiful. You come down the hill and there's the turning to Foxearth. Why would anyone ever go to Foxearth? I don't know. If you take that road, it's a country road that winds along the edge of the River Stour on the border between Suffolk and Essex. I think in 1975 a whole chunk changed there. But between the two counties, if you go south of that river, then fate and style requires you to wear high heels, white high heels, and appear on, what do they call it, the only way is Essex? If you live north of that, then you'd be a right one of them there yokels, boy, from that there Suffolk, you know? I can't read and I can't ride, but I can't off-drive a tractor. And go down Bury Market for a bit of that there pig sticking, you know, boy? So, you know, that was the stereotype of where I grew up. And if you drive along that road, that border road between Essex and Suffolk, you encounter vast swathes of nothing. Now, Kate Bush actually grew up out there amongst those sunken lanes on that border territory, but really there's windswept hedges, ash breaks, occasional small woods called coppices anywhere else, but coppies in Suffolk. And it's a lonely territory. It's a chalk area just on the edge of the clay before you head up into the fens. So it's not even interesting geologically. You ride up that hill, and at the top of it, there's a small church. Suffolk's got 300 churches, 300 church parishes built in the Middle Ages. They used to call it Silly Suffolk, from the Anglo-Saxon word selig, meaning holy. Well, that's what I'm told. Actually, I suspect it's because Suffolk people are a bit silly and soft in the head, like me. But you come to a church, which is really common. And then there's church house, a barn, a sizable farmhouse, a couple of small bungalows and some scraggy wood. You drive around the corner, and the next sign says Borley Green. You've driven past about 5 houses, and then you realise, oh, that was the village of Borley. Really? Village? More of a hamlet, surely. How many of you have been there? Did you get that impression that you can almost blink and you miss it? It is absolutely tiny. 1985. Some of my friends were out there and living in the area. They were actually just down the road, a couple of villages down, where the Bulls built something really strange, but that's another story. I'll get to that in a minute if I remember. But down there, the police turned up. We were out driving. I can't remember why, apart from the fact we were 16 years old and some of our friends had bought cars. Oh yeah, the Sisters of Mercy, the Cult, the Mission. We were goths, that's right. Does anyone remember goths? We used to drive around with our goth music blaring and drive out and meet up with other, groups of delinquent teenagers from Suffolk in graveyards and sit around and chat. And we'd go to the Christopher in Sudbury and we'd drink at the Bull in Long Melford and we'd drive back down to Bury. So that's what you do when you're a teenager out there. There's not much else to do. According to Ed Sheeran, what's his name? Not Ed Sheeran. Is it Ed Sheeran? The ginger-haired guy with the guitar. He grew out there at Framlingham and he claims he drove around the country roads at 90 miles an hour. If you did that, you'd end up dead. But anyway, that's another story. Anyway, out there in the darkness is a village that you can almost miss. So I went back to my grandmother and I said, this here Borley, we were driving past it tonight and it was full of police officers. And she said, that'll be the ghosts. Why would you send lots of police officers out there? Because when I were a girl, they said it was haunted, the rectory there that burnt down in an insurance job. Oh yeah, it's fairly famous, Nan. That's right, and because of that, lots of idiots drive up there from London almost every night and cause trouble. So every year at Halloween, at the village of Borley, they have roadblocks to make sure that no troublemakers get into the village. And to this day, access at night, there's a couple of cameras which go directly down to Sudbury control room at the police station, which seems like an incredibly strange usage of police resources. But if you live in a small, extremely wealthy and prosperous hamlet with a few houses and bungalows, the last thing you probably want is lots of teenagers running around screaming and breaking around your garden at night.
So, one of the things I'm going to start off by stressing as a Suffolk local is, do go to Borley, do visit, be respectful, don't be those idiots. Be careful and don't cause trouble. And if you're asked to move on by the locals, just, shrug and say thank you. Or, chap we know who came from Bury said it was all right as long as we were nice, or something like that, Or, fancy a drink down the Bull, something to suggest you might be local. Or you could try and imitate my terrible accent. Borley today, unfortunately, has very little to see apart from the church. The church became incredibly famous in the 1970s. Did anyone, I don't suppose any of you grew up with Anglia TV, did you? Maybe some of the people in our audience did. But yeah, Anglia TV in the 70s sent a newspaper sent a investigative team from Look East. And the Look East was a kind of tea time magazine show that was on after the news. And they sent them down there. I think there's a Look West or a Bristol equivalent, I can't remember what it's called, but they sent them down there and they went into the church and they took in their equipment and they set it up. And they sat around and smoked 2 cigarettes, and then they started to get a bit cold, and it was a bit dark. And then something coughed outside. They said it was probably a badger or a fox. So they went out into the churchyard, and then it was even colder. And about midnight, they gave up on their vigil, and they went and sat in the van, but they left the tape recorders running. And if you can find it, and I'm sure it's on YouTube, you actually hear the door go, and you hear thumping, and there's various creaking and groaning noises throughout the night, and strange things that they recorded in the church. And actually, now that the rectory has been gone for this 70-odd years, the church is where a lot of the ghost hunting activity is. And I'm sure many of you have heard the story of the secret passage. No? In the 1970s, the East Anglian Psychic Research Group of the time, early 70s, about 73, claims that the tomb, there's a Victorian tomb just outside the door, near the side door of the church. And I'm going from memory here, so you'll have to forgive me if you get there and fall over it in the dark. It's a low tomb with an iron railing around it, and it's got a kind of pointy top and a large stone slab. And they claim that they realised that it was a false burial. There's no burial record of it. So they opened it up, and they found that there's a staircase that goes down and enters a hidden crypt, which is under Borley Church. And Ed Babbs, who was married to the widow of the last vicar of Borley, because now the parish of Borley, Foxworth and Liston have been combined, and the seat is at Liston, he claims to know more about it and that photographs had been taken. And I have many, many, many times thought, well, why doesn't Church House just send an archaeologist down to have a look? Because there appeared to be signs that people had been using an underground chapel beneath the church until relatively recently. And there was one aspect of it that really caught my attention. They said that when they looked through the door, there were lead coffins in niches around. Now, lead was used in some Suffolk burials, but the coffins were moved up. Some of them were on their ends and others were, scattered, and they therefore did not enter the room. But there was a sign on the door that said Harry Bull had 1928 or something like that. It's in Ed Babb's book on Borley. I'm not inventing this. You can go and look up his account of what he was told by the East Anglian Psychic Research Group in the 70s. And his book, Edward Babb's book, he was a member of the Society for Psychical Research, and I had the privilege of knowing him in the 90s. It's an excellent read. And unlike almost everything that's been written on Borley, it's written by somebody who actually lived in Suffolk and knew the place. So I said to my gran, anyway, to go back to my dear old nan, so Alice, did you ever go out to the rectory? Oh yes, all the time. I used to be out there with the codswallop, she said. The what? The codswallop. We all know the word codswallop. Apparently, according to her, codswallop was a lemonade brand. Cod was a Bury St Edmunds-based manufacturer of a lemonade from round about 1880 through to about just after the First World War. And in the years after the First World War, she used to go out on a pony trap and drive out to Borley Rectory and deliver lemonade to the house, to the Ball sisters. And I said to her, what was it like? And she said, big, dark, smelt bad. What? It smelled really bad. They had bad drains. And I thought, well, I've never read that in any book on Borley Rectory. And she said, well, it's impossible to heat. It was damp and it smelt bad and they had rotten drains. And that, but I never saw any ghosts. I don't believe in them. And that was it. That was all she told me. What a letdown. You discover your grandmother delivered lemonade to Borley Rectory and the best she can tell you is it had bad drains. I asked my mum, and she told a story about seeing across the field further back towards Belchamps a strange brown mass moving across the field that smelt, her and her friend Joyce, she said it smelt sweet and sickly, and they watched it wondering what it was. Now, she'd know a sand blow if she saw one. She's a Suffolk gal. But she said it looked like a brown cloud, and it came from the direction of Borley Parish over towards... And she said, and me and Joyce looked at one another, and we sat there and wondered what it was, and then it turned and moved towards us. And she said, we got on our bikes and we rode like hell. So that was my mother's deeply uninteresting ghost story. Anyway, a while later, I did actually see a ghost of my own, and that got me interested enough to actually do some research. This is 1987 by now. I'm still a bit of a goth, but you'll have to, have to add the soundtrack in your mind. And I had a ghostly experience over in Thetford at the Priory with 4 other friends, which we talked about on Ghost Hunters back in the 90s. I don't know if any of you have seen the documentary, but I'm not going to tell the story tonight. That led me to go back to the archive and try and find those books I'd seen. And there I found a whole host of papers about Borley. Some really positive and some totally cynical. But I very quickly became bored with the case because people like Steve find it fascinating and can spend forever rehashing Harry Price's notes. I was interested in things like the tunnel that's just been discovered across the road. Have any of you heard about that? Outside where the house was, near the bottom of the Nun's Walk, there is actually a subterranean tunnel that's been found by ground penetrating radar in the late 90s or early 2000s. And I found this not from the Society for Psychical Research, not from ASAP, not from any of the ghost hunting groups. I found this from Suffolk Highways. I'm guessing it's a culvert because I can see no sane reason why anyone would want to build tunnels under that section of road. But I have actually seen some tunnels up there. And the bulls are stranger than one can imagine. They moved away from the parish, but they built the Bull's Folly. I think it's down near Liston. It's in the woods. What it actually is you go into the woods and there's this brick tower. I guess it's about 50 foot high. And it's got a spiral staircase that goes up inside. And at the top, the roof is open, but there's astrological symbols painted on the walls. And it's got a window, or that they may have been painted by somebody later, of course. But the same Harry Bull, who famously, was at Borley, also built this really peculiar brick tower in the woods. And when we were kids, we used to like to go down there and try and climb it. Apparently, it's really unsafe now. So, if you're interested in this kind of thing, grab an OS map or Google Maps and look up Tower plus Bull. Let's move on to another bull. In memory of my dear friend John Bull, who passed away last summer. He was out at Church House Stanton. John, I was at school with him. We grew up together, and he died of heart failure earlier this year. Late last year. But his childhood home, Church House Stanton, is where he's just been interred. And when we were after the funeral, when we went to find his grandmother's and grandfather's grave where he was being buried by his childhood home, we walked round Church House, and it hit me that I'd heard the name before. And then I remembered where, Gentleman's Quarterly, I think it's about 1750. Have any of you heard the story of the moving coffins of Barbados? Right, yeah, well, if you know the story, basically the Chase family vault in Barbados had a series of lead coffins, and every time they opened the tomb, the coffins had moved of their own volition and were jumbled about. And the only explanation I've ever seen was Joe Nichol, the great skeptic, suggested that it was actually possibly a coded analogy for a Freemasonic rite, and that there were any moving coffins. But if you look in Gentleman's Quarterly, you can discover that there was a version of the same story in Stanton, And although I can't remember the exact date, all of you probably have Google on your phone. So if you look up Stanton, Suffolk moving coffins, by the wonders of technology, you'll be able to read the whole story by the time I've got safely home tonight and had my tea. So, but yeah, now the reason I remembered that was not just the fact we were burying a bull, but the fact that the lead coffins being jumbled up at Stanton reminded me of the description of the lead coffins under Borley. So maybe what we should do is not just worry about Borley Rectory, the most haunted house, and Harry Price and Robert Woods and all of the others have, Tabori and all of the others have written so many words about it. Maybe what we should do is drive out there at night and look at some of the other landscapes of Suffolk and try and get a sense of the context of the overall haunting. 1919. The First World War had ended and two young brothers who were back from the trenches had been at a play at the Theatre Royal in Bury St Edmunds. They got on their motorbikes and they were driving out towards Hall Farm, which is at Bradfield St George, so out in the direction of Borley, down the 134, going south towards Sudbury. And as they were motoring along, they suddenly saw a mysterious glow on the horizon. It looked like, they said, a great fire, a great orange light. And they assumed, logically, that a barn was on fire. So in those days, a barn fire was a terrible tragedy because if you lost your food, the whole community could suffer. They rode home to the farm because they decided that when they got to the farm, what they needed to do was grab some water and then go and find whatever the farm was that was on fire. Now, it wasn't a sunset because this is the middle of the night. So they go out to look for this red, orangey coloured burning barn they think they can see in the distance. And as they drive up, the dog's barking violently. It seems to be scared. And they get off their bike, and then they see what I still regard as one of the most peculiar and frightening phenomena I've ever heard of. From their own living room, where the dog has fled, and where the house is empty, but locked, there's an incredibly bright white light. A brilliance so bright they cannot look upon it. And they shield their eyes, and they said that it was incomparably brighter than the arc lights, the electric arc lights at Bury Football Club, which were probably the brightest lights you'd see in those days. So they made their way round, and they climbed up, and finally they moved around to see if it was a reflection, but no, it seemed to be whatever it was inside their house. So this is two really strange luminous phenomena that night within a few minutes of one another. The dog runs away in terror. They throw open the door, go in, and the light, if it had been a reflection, it would have done what they said, it would have lit up the window, but it lit the whole barnyard. So the light was the source, it was an actual light source that was spreading out. When they enter, there's just darkness. They went out on their bikes, they drove all over the countryside, they roused the police. No one could find a burning barn. Geologically, it's chalk, it's boulder clay. There's nothing there to cause earth lights, there's nothing there to cause this kind of luminous phenomena. This is 1919, it's not a UFO, we don't have a concept of that left. It's just a really weird, anomalous experience, and it happens maybe 10 miles from Borley. And I was reminded then that Borley Rectory at night, they used to say that the windows shone with a strange light. And I also remembered, do many of you know the story of Maria Martin and the Red Barn? If you're ever in Bury St Edmunds, Maria Martin was a dashing young maiden who was murdered by her lover, William Corder, who was a wicked squire, in 1805, I believe. It might be 1815. I've written a really detailed account of it on the web. My blog is And Sometimes He's So Nameless. If you just go there, there's loads of stuff about Borley, Harry Price, all of the stuff I'm talking about. But so popular was the murder trial that Corder's depiction, he used to wear a top hat and had a little moustache that he would twiddle the ends of. It gave rise to an entire genre of Victorian melodrama about squires kidnapping wholesome young maidens. A bit later, they used to tie them to railway lines, but they couldn't, obviously, in 1815, because we hadn't quite invented the railway. But yeah, William Corder was executed, and the place where he killed Maria Martin is called the Red Barn. And the reason it's called the Red Barn is apparently that the sun setting in the west on the horizon from the village used to cause it to appear to be bathed in blood at night. As the sun went down behind, the light would come through the chinks and it would make it appear to be dripping blood. And burning barns or red barns are in Suffolk folklore a symbol of evil. Again, all probably unrelated, but this idea of a shining building, Borley shining. Actually, it was very unfortunate for one young man. He was an Austrian fellow who, in the late 30s, bought a whole load of land around Suffolk. They made a Sky documentary about it a few years ago. And what he did was he built these huge barns that were absolutely useless as barns, but wonderful if you wanted aircraft hangars. And then he concreted nice large barnyards that actually grew up on one of his old farms, a large farm. And as soon as the war started, he was arrested and picked up. And he couldn't understand what he'd done that had attracted the attention so readily of the police, and that for them to realise that he was actually... The idea was, it was a putative German plan to be able to land paratroopers, etc., and actually have forwards, East Anglian air bases if they needed them. I didn't believe any of this was true, but as I said, Sky One managed to find the records in the archive. Just Google Red Barns, Nazi plot, Suffolk, something like that, airfield, you'll find it. But he painted his barns red. And because red barns are such a cursed and unlucky colour, everybody talks about them. Oh, why has he built a bloody red barn then? Well, he's a bit daft, isn't he? He's Austrian. Well, why has he built a bloody red barn though? It's bad luck. Actually, why has he built a red barn? Especially one big enough to hold a whole bunch of aeroplanes, but not big enough. He's not actually growing any crops. Oh, did you say he's Austrian? Isn't that Mr. Hitler Austrian? Oh, yeah. Anyway, you get the idea. Suffolk folklore. Borley had its own legend of a nun. We all know the story? The story was that the nearby monastic house at Bures, B-U-R-E-S, had a nun and a monk who fell in love with one another and eloped, and they were caught. I think some say that she was from Clare, which is where the convent was. Others say that the convent was at Borley. But they were caught at Borley, dragged from their coach, and beheaded. He was beheaded, and she was walled up for her sins. And, I have spent some time going through the manorial histories of Suffolk manors, because I'm really boring, trying to find any kind of ecclesiastical endowment in Borley, and I never have, but I did find that the Waldegraves who were there and who owned it were, of course, famous Catholic sympathisers during the reign of Queen Elizabeth. So it's entirely possible that there could have been nuns called Marie there. Anyway, we get the idea, don't we? So I was a goth. I grew up in Suffolk. I've got really weird parents who tell strange stories, and I was a bit cynical about Borley Rectory. But the point is, contextually, all of this stuff comes together. And you start to think, well, can you take any of it without the rest? Why are we privileging this story over Hall Farm and the Strange Light, or the Burning Barn? Or, my favourite ghost story of all, and we said we'd talk about other hauntings, and I've got 20 minutes, so I'm going to do just that. We're going to go back to my grandmother's son, my mother's brother, my uncle, in fact, Ted. Uncle Ted was a stout man. To be fair, he would make me look diminutive. He was 55 stone. So he was nearly 3 times, in fact, he was 3 times my body weight. And he was massive. And he was also of that generation who wore their trousers, their waistband just below their nipples. And he always used to wear big green Trek trousers. He was a wonderful man, but my father had to make him reinforced iron chairs to sit upon. Anyway, Uncle Ted, happily married, he lived to be, they kept telling him, Ted, you'll lose weight. If you don't, he worked in a mortuary, and they said, if you don't lose weight, you're going to be next year, you're going to die. He lived till he was 88. He slimmed down, he lost 30 stone, went out in the ice with a dog, Jumble. Dog was pulling at something, a cat or something, slipped on the ice, fell over and hit his head. And his wife said, if he hadn't lost all that weight, there's no way he could have hit his head, is there? Very sad story. But anyway, my Uncle Ted, when he was a schoolboy, 14 years old, before he joined the Fleet Air Arm and served in the war, he was out delivering for Orban Davis. And I was surprised the other day, I was in in Suffolk, and I discovered that Broughton's, which is part of Auburn Davis, that chain still exists. And what they used to do before the war, the Second War, was they used to go out and they would have a catalogue, because at harvest time each year, the local labourers would be given a harvest bonus, which would be a significant sum of money. And the harvest bonus might be, I don't know, a quarter of their annual pay. And at that time, it was traditional for them to buy new clothes to last them for the winter. So the local gentlemen's outfitters, Broughton's, Davis, etc., they knew this, so they used to go round all the farms and all the farm cottages and take their catalogues, which were the internet of the day. The mail order catalogue really did revolutionise shopping for most people in that period. So, he was 14 years old. The old man, Auburn Davis, he used to drive out in his car, which was, I think he said it was a Rolls Royce, but to be honest, I think, any car was a Rolls Royce when you grew up like he did, with a bike, and that was it. He drove out, and he was in the back of the car with a stack of them, and they'd drive up to the cottages, and he'd jump out, he'd run up and put them through the door. And they were driving down the road between Rougham, Rough, A-M, Rougham, and Bradfield St George. Very easy places to find on a map. I should have brought one. And suddenly, he saw this great big house, and he said it was Queen Anne style, so it had kind of dormer windows, which are windows set into the roof. And it had beautiful flowers. Beautiful flowers it had. You're right, boy? They're Suffolk, that very proper beautiful. Had all these beautiful flower beds, and he said it had a gravel drive and a yellow wall and gates. And he shouted out to the old man, "You've missed one, you missed a house." And the old man looked over his shoulder and said to him, "Bugger it!" And he put his foot down. He started to reverse or turn the car, and as they did, he said there was a sudden rush of wind, and the house had gone. Well, it's a classic tall story, isn't it? Everywhere else in the world, people have got ghosts that haunt houses, not in Suffolk. Our ghosts are houses. So, I thought, but I heard the story when I was a boy, and it was stories like that which led me to believe that ghosts were a load of rubbish. But I asked him about it years later when I got interested in ghosts, and he said, "Oh yeah, absolutely true, absolutely, completely true. That happened to me, and it happened to other people as well." And then Audrey, my mother, bless her, she's still going, she's a good old gal, she said, "A friend of mine at work, she saw that house that Uncle Ted saw. She calls it the Fairy Cottage." What? Well, Mum works at the West Suffolk Hospital, where she was a hospital hygienist, kitchen cleaning, looking after things. This is a woman who, if she ever found a rat in the washing up, would give it a good rinse before she put it in the garden. But anyway, no, I'm joking. She's not quite that bad. But when we lived on a farm, I shudder. But she's a great woman. And she used to have a friend at work who insisted that sometimes when she was driving to work, she'd come down the hill and there'd be a small cottage on a wood on the left-hand side. And this cottage had a yellow wall. So I said, "Well, that's not the same house, is it? It's nothing like the description from Uncle Ted." And then I found it. It's in... I'm not going to look it up exactly. It's on my blog if you just look up The Disappearing House. But in the 1970s, before I was very old, about 75, when I was about 6, a gardening magazine carried a story by Mr. Cobbold, who'd been out with his butcher's pony trap, delivering down Kingshall Street between Rougham and Bradfield St George, when he had experienced on a summer's day whoosh, and suddenly there'd been this big house where there had previously been no house, and the pony trap took off, and he was thrown, but he got a good look at the house, and they looked at it and they saw it. And so we started to collect stories, and we found not one or two, but over 20 different accounts. And I thought, folklore, isn't it? It's got to be. But then I realised something really, really interesting about these accounts. Do you remember the story, the difference between the first two I heard? Most of the people see from Kingshall Street a great big house that's standing by the road, set back with lawns, Queen Anne mansion. But my mother's friend and some of the others had seen a small cottage. And then I realised what they're actually seeing is the gatekeeper's cottage at the back of the property. And then I came across the final bit that really which really got me interested. Haunted Houses by, what's his name, Bennett. Bennett was, I believe, a High Court judge, but I could be wrong, who in 1936 did a broadcast for the BBC where he appealed for information on people's ghost stories. And two women, a Mrs. Wynne and a Mrs. Allison, who had travelled to Bury St Edmunds and had been staying out at the village at Rougham or Bradfield, had gone out for a walk one day, and they had responded in 36 with their account of the house. Now, the gardening version had actually occurred in the 1880s or 1890s, so we now had stories that dated from around about 1880, 1890, right the way through to 1970, of the same apparition, a house. I don't know about you and me, but finding a phantom nun seems positively difficult compared with catching a phantom house. It's either there or not there. I mean, you know, we could shove a webcam up to watch for it. We could fire a drone overhead. We could, I don't know, there's just so many ways you could keep an eye on what's going on. Furthermore, it seems to make some kind of geographical sense. Once you work out the roads, you can work out roughly where it should be. If the cottage they saw was at the back and the main house is at the front. So we went out to the field and we thought, okay, we'll go and have a look for this. And it was me, Dave the Munchkin, Marcus Holland, a bunch of my friends. We drove out there and we parked up and we walked across the field, and it's much the same as the field around Borley. If you ever want a bit of Borley brick, I've got a bit, you can drive out to the field behind the house, and where the rubble from the house has slowly been ploughed in, there's all kinds of bits of pan tile and brick, etc. I should sell them on the internet, really, shouldn't I? Genuine brick from Borley. Get one here, £5, 500, I don't know what you could charge. But yeah, there seems to be debris, but that doesn't prove anything because there's all kinds of debris. By this time, I found out that Tony Cornella, the Society for Psychical Research, very distinguished investigator, had spent years going through the maps trying to locate the house. And he'd traced it back to 1815, and there was certainly no house on the site after the 1815 New Military Road, as it's called, was placed down Kingshall Street. We found an earlier map from the 1730s that shows a family coat of arms and shows a house near the site. The problem is that 18th century maps are basically cartoons. People just draw a "here be dragons," or the house is sort of vaguely there, and maybe they drew it on the right side of the road and maybe they didn't. But anyway, so we walked around. It was a hot day, because it always seems to appear in the middle of August. It was boiling hot, 1988 or 9. Walking around the field, and then we came to a coppice of wood, and it's a narrow long wood between two fields, and we'd walked basically down the side of the field, and we'd come back down, and we thought, well, we may as well walk down here rather than try and walk diagonally across the farmer's field. So we're walking through the wood, and then I had one of those revelation moments when you just want to jump up and down and shout "Eureka!" Because I suddenly noticed that we were walking down the middle of the wood and it was sunken. On either side it was higher, so it was kind of a ditch, if you like, a dip in the middle of the wood. And then I saw that on either side there were trees that were massive, but nearly all the rest of the trees in the middle were really small. And I finally worked it out. We were walking down an avenue of trees, with a wall on either side, behind the trees, or in front of the trees, I can't remember which way around it was in front of the trees. There had been a brick wall on either side, and those brick walls are still there today. If you scrape the soil away, you can find the yellow bricks that were described in the ghost story. You can see the avenue that led up to the house, and you can see these mighty trees that were built. There's no reason to plant trees on either side of a road unless it leads somewhere. And this obviously had led to a house. But since that time, trees have grown and infilled the area. So you can go there. It's the corner, it's where Kingshall Street, between Bradfield, St George and Rougham, takes a sharp turn. And you can walk along there and you can survey the area and see that there's the remains of ancient fish ponds. And the fish ponds were part of the description of the house as well. But you can actually see where there are ponds still that are long since overgrown. No sign of a house. No sign of a house in the records. I cannot work out if I had a name I could trace it through the West Suffolk archives easily. But without knowing what the house ever was, yet no story, no local story of a house that burnt down, no story of a house ever being there. No one locally seems to know anything of such a building, and we've tried asking the local historians, and they're not stupid. So whatever led to the destruction of this building that I'm convinced stood there, for some reason, it caused it to be erased from history, forgotten. But not quite forgotten, because every few years, some poor sod driving down that road feels a sudden whoosh of cold air, and there's the building, standing as real as any other. And the strange thing about it, if you saw it, who would run into it? Yeah, that's my thought was, it's like a TARDIS, isn't it? It might be a bit Brigadoon. You might come back and find it's the 2040s. Pop music may be better. Hey, you'd be younger. Well, in comparison with the rest of your friends, they'd all be a lot older. But the really weird bit about it is, if I'm correct, and apparitions are largely constructed internally, which doesn't mean they're not real, but I think that they're generated by the process of the mind. This seems to put the light to that, because it is a physical object, because it's displacing air. It's like somebody's dropping a house there, and as they drop the house into the space, the air is displaced. And it is an air displacement effect that is common to all these stories written by different people over 70 or 80 years. And while some of them just don't fit and just sound like they were made up, and there are a couple, the majority of them, I'd say 85, 90%, seem to agree in detail. The stories are not well known. I grew up out there without ever hearing them. Yet, a bit of poking around and you'll soon find them. So, ladies and gentlemen, I challenge you. You could go to Borley. You could hang around at night hunting ghosts and trying to find out if it really was the most haunted house in England. Or you could drive 5 miles down the road to Rougham, take a picnic with you, explore the archaeological remains of the house I've described, and see if you can actually see it, and see if you can work out the secret. You can go to Rangett Street archive in Bury St Edmunds, Suffolk, and you can find the original documents relating to Borley. You could go to Long Melford and go down to the Bull and talk to people there, and they will tell you a load of rubbish in it. Oh, I never heard it. Never seen any ghost in my time. But they said that in the 1930s. And do you know what? In 1931, there were so many people turning up in motor cars from London to look at Borley that the police closed the road. 1931. 54 years later, they reinstituted it. If you want to know more about it, West Suffolk Police are pretty good people. You want the Sudbury station, they will talk to you. They are friendly. Generally speaking, as long as you've got a bit of time, you're fairly sensible, the locals don't bite. But when we talked about should we do an event about Borley near there, I said, I don't want to get shot. So please, show respect to the locals. I am a Suffolk lad. I've tried to put Borley in the context of a teenager who grew up surrounded by these stories, surrounded by the history of psychical researchers, many of whom I've known people who knew many of them. I still do, Mary Rose Barrington and others who actually knew some of the people we've mentioned tonight. And me and Steve can talk for hours about their peccadillos and their faults and their failings. But there's more to Suffolk and there's more to ghosts than Borley. And I would encourage all of you to go out there, find your own case, and do something far more interesting than rehashing Price's legacy. Create something new. So, any questions? And sometimes he's so nameless. It's a line from Jefferson Airplane's song, Rather. It's my favourite song. And sometimes he's so nameless. I think we've got some more time, so I hope somebody will come up with a question. Has anyone actually been to Borley then? Would anyone like to tell us about their experiences at Borley?
Well, we went about 20 years ago.
Yes, we went about 20 years or so ago, and it was in the height of the summer,
We had a little look around the churchyard and what have you, but didn't experience anything abnormal or what have you. But you were right about the area. It's definitely a very strange little place in the middle of nowhere. And we didn't go in the antique shops.
Oh, you didn't go in the antique shops? Long Melford and Lavenham are filled with antique shops. They're great places. If you go down to Long Melford, the Bull has a story, I think it's 1578. There was a murder there. Two men got drunk and they were fighting, and one of them ran the other one through with a rapier several times, and he fell stone dead. And what they did was they laid him out for the inquest that was called. And I don't know if you're aware, but in medieval and onwards through early modern England, it was a really bad idea to have a body turn up in your parish. Because if the murderer wasn't actually found, then the burial costs would be inflicted upon the parish. They would end up paying for it. So people had a bit of a grudge against dead bodies turning up. But in this case, it was an open and shut case. And the chap who had committed the murder was apprehended and taken off to the jail. And the body was laid out, and by the time the court of inquest could be brought together, and they'd actually found enough people to actually come and, bring the legal proceedings thing, they went into the room to look at the body, and it had gone. So, this is the first known use of the English law of corpus delicti, which means that basically there's no body, there's no murder. And recently, in recent years, common sense has prevailed, and that is no longer the case. And some of the poor police officers in Wiltshire, I think it was, or Gloucestershire, had to spend a great deal of time trying to find evidence to convict a chap who'd killed his wife, supposedly, but when there was no body. But yeah, that happened at the Bull. And the Bull itself had a poltergeist case and was fairly famously haunted back in the 1880s, 1890s. And pretty much everywhere around that part of Suffolk has got ghost stories, but most of them are really dull. They are coach, headless horseman, rattle through the village at midnight, turn all the other way, old smuggling type legends and all that stuff. There's a Lover's Lane at Badwell Ash, which I liked, because in the 60s a bunch of courting couples got caught out by their partners after running screaming to the police, because night after night, in the Lover's Lane, a burning red light would bob down the road and look in through the window of the cars where they were making out. And apparently it caused a bit of a scandal because nobody was aware how many people from Bury were driving out to this village lane. I suspect that it wasn't actually a ghost. I suspect it was either a local pervert who was inventing dogging, I believe they call it, or alternatively, it was an angry husband looking for his wife. But it's all a bit Scooby-Doo, isn't it? There are some great ghost stories out there. There's some wonderful things that go on around Borley. Yeah.
Getting back to your moving coffins and the house that disappears, roughly in the same area.
Yeah.
Looking at geology as well as chalk, maybe something underneath. Do you reckon they could be related magnetically, or
In the 1990s, I made an episode of Ghost Hunters for Discovery Science called Spectres of the Seven, in which I put forward the hypothesis that seismic stress, tectonic stress along fault lines could in some way correlate to hauntings. And we actually found some evidence for it. Of course, the problem is that, unfortunately, faulting quite often occurs in valleys in the southwest. And people tend to live in valleys. If you look at Stroud, for example, it's a great example, even in Bristol, population tends to avoid areas where you don't get faults because they tend to be either mountainous or bogs, as far as I can work out. But anyway, yeah, I'm not convinced that there's any evidence of that in Suffolk because the actual ground is glacial moraine, boulder clay, right the way down to the escarpment that Borley lies on, where it becomes chalk. The chalk is very easy to tunnel through. And most of the stories around Bury St Edmunds involve tunnels, and a lot of the stories around Borley and around Suffolk generally involve tunnels and hidden passageways. I have wondered repeatedly if the 1970s crypt, the crypt under the church, the hidden crypt, could have been responsible for the sounds recorded during the Anglia TV broadcast. Because if somebody had entered the crypt if it's well known and was still available to the ecclesiastical authorities, had closed it off as it would appear in the 20s, it's possible that the noises that are being heard in that broadcast are nothing more than somebody entering a crypt underneath and making noises simply to disturb the film crew above. I don't know.
I mean, the reason why I sort of asked that, I'm an ex-soldier.
Yeah.
Done many exercises on solitary plane.
Yeah.
I have seen lights, not military lights or anything. I've seen lights, and that is all on chalk.
On chalk?
Solitary plane is got a lot of chalk on it. I've seen lights rise across the grass. I mean, you're talking probably 50 to 100 yards.
Yeah. Small balls of light. I've worked on earthquake lights for the last 20 years.
I mean, when you're on stag and you're in a trench and you've got nothing to do and nothing to see, I mean, you've got to be awake. I've seen it 2 or 3 times. And then you think it's like somebody creeping around with a flare or something, but these things just hover. I've seen orange ones, blue ones, slightly white, bluey things, and they just disappear.
I remember John saying he used to see the blue ones in the churchyard at Stanton, where the moving coffins were, because they would rise up from the graves, but they were put down as being corpse candles, they call them in Suffolk.
They just appear.
Yeah,
they just 2 or 3 feet above the ground. They just whiff
if you approach them, they disappear, and they never move very high. No.
About 3 or 4 feet, and within about 5 or 6 seconds they're gone.
We saw one. Me and Becky, Dr. Becky Smith, parapsychologist, my girlfriend's at the back of the room. We took a bunch of people to the Great Churchyard in Bury St Edmunds 10 years ago or so, and as we walked through it, we suddenly saw these 2 lights that moved through the gravestones. And by the time we'd said, Becky, look over there, and she'd said, what, over there? And we said, no, over there. She never saw them. They disappeared that quickly. But we all definitely, 3 or 4 of us definitely got a good look at them. I think partly also, if you're a soldier and you're used to being on night exercises, you know what's a distant car headlight, you know what's a shooting star. You absolutely are able to identify different things moving. One of my most tragic experiences ghost hunting near Borley was near Hartist. Rachel Martin, she took me out with Darren one night because there was a wood there that's supposedly haunted by a maiden who killed herself after she got pregnant. So we went down to the meadow at the bottom of her garden and we walked through in the darkness across towards the woods. And you could tell that I'm no soldier because suddenly this thing went, whoa! And of course, I turned, squealed and ran for my life, terrified. Darren followed after me and Rachel said, why are you running away from a cow? Because you could just see its white, it was a Frisian cow, but it just had this white head looming out of the darkness that was going, woo! And then there was another night, we were at Borley, and we were walking down the hedge on the road to Belchamp St Paul, which is where, if any of you know M.R. James, Count Magnus, read Count Magnus by M.R. James. I grew up adjacent to where he lived as a child. It's a fantastic story, but it's the ending of it. It happens at the crossroads at Belchamp St Paul, which is right by Borley. Anyway, we were walking down the road one night, and my mate Dave the Munchkins we called him, we were ghost hunting, but Dave turned around and he made a joke about the Met. And I can't remember what it was. It was a joke about, entrance qualifications for the Met. And let's just say that it wasn't entirely... And then we heard voices laughing. And we're in a sunken lane with a hedge on either side. And, what are you doing there, lads? At the next moment, a WPC and a PC. Now, there's only like 5 police cars in Suffolk at night. I mean, they're hardly over-policed. We're in the middle of nowhere, absolutely the middle of nowhere, walking down a sunken lane. There's not a car in sight. We're 5 miles from the nearest place, 2 miles from the nearest house. And Dave has managed to crack a joke about the police, about the Met, just as 2 coppers emerged from behind a hedge. So they said, where are you going? And we said, we're hunting ghosts. Is it haunted round here? Yeah. Well, we won't be sticking around then. Well, why are you here? Police business. And we kind of looked at this young man and this young woman, and we looked at the grass stains and we thought, they've either been on a really long-term surveillance in that hedge, or this is something we don't need to know about. So we said, thank you very much. And Dave said, I'm really sorry about my joke. And they said, that's all right, we're not Met. And then they started telling us jokes about the Met, and that went on for about 5 or 6 minutes before they finally let us go. And they ignored the fact that Marcus was carrying a broken shotgun under his arm, and that Dave was carrying, I think, a stout cudgel, and that I was just wandering around with long hair, with like flowers painted on my jeans because I was a hippie man. And despite all of that, they paid no attention at all. Like, have a good night, lads. Bye. And off they went. And they jumped in their cruiser down the road and drove off. But to this day, I still wonder if there was something bizarrely supernatural about that. Anyway. Right, any more questions? How are we doing for time? Yeah, we're okay to keep going? Right, well, has any of you, I mean, locally, Bristol has got some fantastic stories. Do any of you know the story of the disappearing house of Dursley? Yeah? I think it's 18th century, isn't it, or 19th century. The idea is that there's a traveller who was coming down across, what's the common, Rodborough Common? Yeah, he's coming down Rodborough Common at night, down towards Dursley, or Stroud, actually, I think. Yeah, from Stroud, he's heading to Dursley. He's crossing over Rodborough Common, or somewhere around there, and he comes across an inn, and he goes into the inn, and it's a bitterly cold night, and he's exhausted, and he realises he's not going to make it. So he takes his horse in, and he ties it up, and he pays the money, and according to the normal version of the story, when he makes it to Dursley, he asks about the inn, and they say, there hasn't been an inn there for 50 years. But the other version you hear, which I think is probably the older one, is actually the fairy version, which is where he wakes up in the morning and he's lying on a brock, and there's coins laying next to him, and there's snow all around undisturbed, but his belly's full and he's warm and he's had a good night's rest. But either way, there's the story of a disappearing house up there. And there's various other disappearing house stories around the UK, but they are generally fairly uncommon and fairly rare. So they're one of those things that, again, they actually should be properly investigated, but sometimes you have to be aware of the fact they are just folk tales. The bear at Rodborough, high up near Woodchester Mansion above Stroud, I had a peculiar, uncanny experience that one night. I'll tell this story then, the last story for tonight. I was a young know-it-all. I was in my 30s, I think, and they brought out this new TV show called Most Haunted. Now, I'd never actually seen Most Haunted, but by an accident of history, I kind of got mixed up with some people who eventually became involved with it. A guy called Phil, who used to wear a mesh top. He was a model, and he had a clipboard, laptop engineer, Phil Wyman, great guy. We'd met at another event where I'd accidentally, it doesn't matter. A series of ridiculous events had led me to actually discover this show called Most Haunted. And it turned out that one of the producers was a woman who'd met me in TV land a few years before and had said, I like you, Chris. I'd love to make a show with you, but you've got a funny shaped head and walk like a duck. Well, yeah, deep sigh. Funny shaped head and walk like a duck. That's it. That's my TV career for you. So, when Most Haunted started, she'd better remain nameless, but she was highly placed in the business, shall we say. No, she wasn't on the show. She was on the technical side. She said, would you like to watch it? And I said, no, it sounds terrible. And she said, I'll send you a copy of the production masters. And I said, go on then. So she sent me a box of tapes. And you might think that being a ghost hunter, the first thing I would do is put those tapes in my little video recorder and watch them and get really excited. The problem was I didn't own a TV. So one night I asked my mate, Andy, could I come over to his house and I'd watch some. But by that time, my mate Phil had convinced me. He'd gone off to do a show called Scream Team, and he asked me, would I replace him as Chimera on the Most Haunted forum? Do any of you remember the old Most Haunted forum? I was called CJ.23 on it. I was on the Most Haunted forum for years, and it was great. It was awesome. I learned more about ghosts there than I have in 20 years on the SPR or ASAP or any of that. The Most Haunted forum was a brilliant place to hang out. It had cool people. Anyway, I was on there. I replaced Phil, who was Chimera. So, I was CJ, and Phil couldn't actually post because he was running around with a bunch of teenage lap dancers in a silver van. It really was. A girl called Amy, she was cute. Anyway, I didn't get that gig. I ended up doing the Most Haunted thing. So I used to type about this show night after night after night. I'd talk on the forum, but the thing was that the first 2 series happened, and I'd never seen it. I never admitted that I'd never actually seen it, but I didn't own a TV. And then when I did actually manage to borrow a TV, it turned out you needed to have cable, and I hadn't got cable. So I never said I'd watched it, I just talked about ghosts, because I like the people, and they were really nice. And then finally, as I said, the lady sent me, Jane, she sent me these tapes. So I went over to my friend's house, and I put one on, and it was diabolical. I mean, it was bloody awful. I mean, it was embarrassing. It was cringeworthy. And I thought, wow. Like, just wow. And it would be that week that I suddenly got an offer from the TV production company. Would I turn up and do a show for them? And I said, yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll come along and appear on your show. Yeah, sounds great. Woo! I'm going to look like an idiot. Oh, well, I'm an idiot anyway. What? So at the Bear at Rodborough one night, I was sitting there talking to my friends, and we were sitting at a table, and people were enjoying their dinner, and there's this couple sitting next to me. I had no idea who they were, but they were obviously listening in to what we were saying, and we were talking about ghost hunting. And then somebody there said, so, what's this show you're doing tomorrow, Chris? And I said, well, what's this show you've been asked to take part in? And I said, well, I've been asked to do some research for a show called Most Haunted. Have you ever seen it? Just once. It's got this woman called Yvette who blasphemes and screams all the time. Really annoying. And there's this guy called Carl who thinks he's a ninja or something. And I went on and I spent the next 10 solid minutes slagging off Carl and Yvette. At which point the people on the next table said, can we join you? And I said, please do. And I said, I'm Chris, and they said, oh, I'm Yvette, this is Carl. And I went, oh, nice to meet you. It's funny, we just talked about people called that from this TV show called Most Haunted. Yeah, we heard you say how awful it was, yeah. What would you do better? Don't know why, because that's us. And that was how I met Carl and Yvette. And to be fair, they never held it against me in the slightest. They were absolutely fine until they sacked me around about 2 series later. But that's neither here nor there. So they were great people, and it was a good time. And actually, when I watch it now, I'm really nostalgic for those days, and I wish that we could go back to it. And the last question, I suppose, for tonight then, as we must be running out of time by now, I always talk too long. After Most Haunted and 700 psychic research groups in the UK, what was a hobby for 50 or so ghost hunters and parapsychologists and eminent know-it-alls from the Society for Psychical Research like myself and other idiots, has now become a massive thing that people are doing everywhere. We have democratised ghost hunting. We have let everyone do it, and I think we're better off for it. And nowadays, people all over the world are hunting ghosts. But we're not actually getting any evidence, are we? So far. Well, maybe we are. Some people, it depends what you regard as evidence. But night after night after night, people say, would you like to see my ghost photos? And the most convincing ones I see always have one thing in common. I get slapped after I say, I can see a face. That looks like an arm. Because it turns out they're actually an excited new parent's ultrasound scan. Because I cannot tell the difference between ultrasound scans, which are blurry and confusing, and so-called ghost pics. And so, I don't know where we're going. I don't know where we've been. We know what we're knowing, but we can't say what we're seeing. That's talking heads. But anyway, but one day, perhaps, we will get somewhere in this subject. But it requires us to go out there and not take ourselves too seriously, and actually experiment and try time and time again to find some real ghosts. So thank you for being so patient with my rambling.